Tonight we're heading deep beneath the porches of Texas, into the forgotten soil where secrets sleep and the past refuses to stay buried. From rusted boxes filled with strange remains to claw-marked foundations and whispering crawl spaces, these are 20 of the most disturbing things ever found buried beneath Texas homes. But before we dig deeper, here's something unsettling. Most viewers make one big mistake. They watch and vanish without subscribing. And by doing so, they miss the darkest stories this state has ever kept hidden. Don't be one of them. Hit subscribe right now, because once we start uncovering what's beneath these porches, there's no going back. So tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Because in Texas, the ground remembers everything. Now let's begin digging into the darkness. The old farmhouse sat on the edge of Fredericksburg, tucked behind a line of pecan trees that had been there long before the highway was paved. It was the kind of place realtors called full of character, which really meant it needed more work than anyone wanted to do. The porch sagged in the middle, the paint was flaking like dried skin, and the boards creaked even when no one was walking on them. When the renovation crew arrived, they were already running late in the summer heat, the kind that stuck to your clothes and filled your mouth with dust. It was Eric who first noticed the hollow sound. He was prying up the old porch planks with a crowbar, when one of them gave an empty thud that didn't match the rest. He paused, crouched down, and tapped again. Definitely hollow. The other guys were busy ripping out rotted railings and didn't pay him much attention. He pried up the board, expecting to find old wiring or a rat nest, but instead he saw a box. It was made of dark wood, sealed shut with rusted nails about the size of a shoebox. It looked old, older than the house itself. He called over his coworker, Miguel, who peered into the hole and frowned. Maybe someone buried their savings, he said. They joked about treasure for a minute before Eric tugged it loose. The box was heavier than it looked. The wood was strangely cold despite the heat. When they set it on the porch, they noticed something else. It was faint but unmistakable. A sound. It was coming from inside the box. At first it sounded like static, then, as they leaned closer, they realized it was music.
A lullaby.
Tinny and warbled like it was being played on an old cassette player. They looked at each other, uneasy now. The box had no holes, no speakers, nothing that could make sound. Eric laughed nervously and said it must be some kind of prank, a hidden device or an old player stuck on repeat. But the longer they stood there, the clearer the music became, weaving through the hot afternoon air like a child humming from a distance. They brought it inside, set it on a workbench, and pried it open with a flathead screwdriver. The nails groaned as if they didn't want to let go. Inside was a layer of yellowed fabric, the kind that might have been part of a curtain once. Beneath that was a cassette player, an old portable kind from the 80s, scuffed and scratched. Its plastic cover was cracked. And yes, inside it was a tape labeled only with one word written in faded ink: lullaby. The player was running. The wheels were turning slowly. But when Miguel picked it up, there were no batteries in the compartment. It just kept playing. Eric turned it off, or tried to. The button stuck halfway down and the sound warped, slowing until the song became a low moan. Then it stopped. For a few seconds there was silence, then a soft click. The tape started moving again on its own. They backed away. The air in the room had grown colder, though the windows were open. Miguel swore and left to smoke outside, saying he didn't get paid enough for this kind of thing. Eric stayed behind. He didn't know why, but he felt pulled to it. The tune was familiar somehow, though he couldn't place where he'd heard it before. It reminded him of something his grandmother used to hum when he was small, back when they lived near Marble Falls. When the foreman, Tom, came to check on them, Eric showed him the box. Tom rolled his eyes, muttering that it was probably some weird art project. He picked up the cassette player and shook it lightly. The music stuttered, then stopped completely. "See dead batteries or a loose spring," he said. He set it back down and told them to get back to work. That night, Eric couldn't sleep. The melody kept looping in his head. Around 2 in the morning, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Miguel. "You hear that song too?" Eric didn't answer. He went to the window instead, half expecting to see someone outside. There was nothing but the faint shimmer of heat lightening over the hills. He went back to bed, trying to tell himself it was just exhaustion, the kind that comes from long days in Texas sun. The next morning, when he arrived at the house, the others were standing by the porch looking uneasy. Miguel wasn't there. His truck was parked crooked by the fence, door open, keys still inside. They found him in the field behind the house, sitting in the grass, staring at nothing. When they tried to talk to him, he just kept humming the same tune that had played from the tape. They took him to the hospital in Fredericksburg, where he didn't say another word. The doctors said it might have been heat stroke or exhaustion, but Eric knew better. That afternoon, he went back to the box. The cassette player was gone. Tom swore he hadn't moved it. The lid lay open, the fabric missing. By late evening, Eric was packing up his tools when he heard it again. The same lullaby, faint but clear, coming from under the porch. He crouched down and shone his flashlight into the crawl space. The beam caught a reflection, metal glinting in the dirt. He reached in and pulled out the cassette player. It was still spinning, still playing, and now there were muddy fingerprints all over it, small ones like a child's. Eric dropped it and stepped back. The music didn't stop. It grew louder, distorting into something that no longer sounded human. It wasn't just a song anymore, it was breathing, like someone trying to sing through water. He stumbled backward off the porch, tripping over the grass, and the music cut off abruptly. He didn't go back inside after that. He told Tom he was done, left the keys to the truck, and drove out of town that night. A few days later, a sheriff's deputy called him. The renovation site had been shut down. Tom was missing. When they searched the house, they found the box sealed again, buried back beneath the porch where it had been before. And when they pried it open, there was nothing inside. No tape, no player, just a scrap of yellowed fabric and a single word written in dust on the wood beneath it. Hush. The house was finally sold months later to a couple from San Antonio. They tore out the porch completely and built a new one. The construction crew didn't find anything unusual this time, except for one detail the new owners mentioned to a neighbor later. Every night around midnight, they said, they could hear a faint tune drifting through the floorboards. A soft lullaby, old and warped, playing from somewhere below. When the foundation of the old ranch house on the edge of Lubbock started to buckle, Alan Greer was the one they called to inspect it. He wasn't an engineer, just a local landscaper who'd done enough foundation work to know when soil had gone bad. The property was 10 miles south of town, past cotton fields and windbreaks of mesquite, in a place where wind never stopped and the dirt itself felt ancient. The owners, a couple from Dallas trying to restore a piece of Texas history, said the floors had begun to slope. Alan crouched down at the corner of the porch, his gloves coated in fine red dust, and began to dig along the base where the concrete met the earth. The soil was loose as if recently disturbed, though the couple swore no one had touched it in years. The first thing he found wasn't unusual, a broken marble, maybe from a child's toy. But as he brushed aside another layer, something small and white gleamed in the sunlight. He picked it up. It was a tooth. A child's tooth, unmistakable in its rounded crown and short root. He thought maybe an animal had dragged it from somewhere. But when he dug again, his trowel struck something hard, something arranged. A circle of teeth, tiny and perfect, embedded in the dirt like pearls in clay. Alan sat back on his heels, staring. The ring was about the size of a dinner plate, every tooth facing inward. He didn't tell the couple what he found. They already looked like city people out of their depth, and he figured it might have been a strange old folk thing. West Texas had its share of them. He took a picture on his phone and covered it back up. But that night, while cleaning his boots, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He zoomed in on the photo. Every tooth was clean, polished even, not yellowed or brittle. And there were so many. 20, 30 maybe, all too uniform to have fallen naturally. He tried to sleep, but a dry wind kept tapping branches against his trailer. And somewhere around midnight, he dreamed of teeth pushing through the soil like sprouting seeds. The next morning, he went back before sunrise, claiming he needed to check soil moisture. The owners hadn't arrived yet. Alan brought a flashlight and a spade. The circle was still there, untouched, and when he dug deeper, he found another beneath it and then another. 3 layers of circles, each one smaller than the last, descending like a spiral. He unearthed at least 100 teeth before stopping, every one child-sized, none adult. He noticed faint lines scratched into the foundation, symbols he didn't recognize, loops and crosses and spirals carved shallow into the concrete. The further he looked, the more he saw them, covering the entire base of the house, almost hidden under the paint. A pattern meant for something. He told himself he'd call the sheriff, but he didn't. He filled the hole again, wiped the sweat from his neck, and packed his tools. That evening, he got a call from the couple. They said they'd started hearing noises from under the floorboards. Scratching, tapping, whispering maybe. Alan told them it was probably mice, but when he hung up, he realized the wind outside had stopped. Completely. No rustle, no hum from the power lines, just a silence so deep it pressed against his ears. The next day, the couple left town abruptly. Alan saw the moving truck pass by as he watered his front yard. They didn't wave. A week later, he heard from a friend that they'd abandoned the house altogether, said something about mold or bad air, and were refusing to come back. Alan didn't tell anyone what he knew. Curiosity got the better of him again. He drove out one night, past the barbed wire and the low hills that looked like sleeping giants. The moon was low and the house sat dark. He parked by the windmill and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The ground around the foundation looked different, uneven, as if something had shifted underneath. Inside, the air was thick and damp. The wooden floors bowed downward near the center of the living room. He knelt and pressed his ear to the boards. At first only silence, then faintly a sound like something small and brittle turning in dirt. He tore up one of the planks. The stench hit him first, dry rot and something metallic. Beneath the joist, packed into the clay, were rows of teeth. Hundreds, maybe thousands, embedded like fossils. Each one set upright, forming perfect concentric circles that pulsed slightly in the beam of his light, as if breathing with the earth. Alan stumbled back. His boot hit something. A child's shoe, half buried, the fabric long decayed but still holding shape. He ran outside, gasping in the warm air, but the night had gone eerily still. The crickets had stopped. From under the house came a slow, steady creak, the sound of wood bending. He aimed the flashlight toward the crawl space. The dirt moved. Not shifting like from a rodent, but rising, lifting. Teeth began pushing upward one by one, forcing themselves out of the soil like pale worms. Some rolled toward him, clattering softly, forming a new circle at his feet. Perfect, deliberate, symmetrical. Alan froze. The air smelled of dust and iron. In the light, he saw one of the teeth twitch. Not much, just a small shiver like it was trying to move. He stepped back, then again. His foot caught the edge of a root and he fell hard. The beam of his flashlight swung across the house, illuminating the carvings on the walls. Those same symbols, looping and spiraling, only now deeper, carved clean through the paint into the wood. They formed a pattern leading down toward the crawl space, a funnel of marks pointing inward. Something underneath the foundation was being contained, not hidden. He realized that too late. The ground beneath him gave a low groan. Then from the open crawl space a sigh escaped, a wet collective exhale like hundreds of mouths opening at once. The circle of teeth at his feet shuddered, shifted, and rolled toward him. He scrambled to his truck, started the engine, and tore down the dirt road until the house vanished in the dust. He didn't go to the police. Who would believe it? He deleted the photo from his phone, but that night when he plugged the charger in, the screen lit up with the same picture again. Only now the teeth were arranged differently, smaller rings inside larger ones like an eye, and at the center a dark gap, wide and deep. Alan left Lubbock a few days later. He took a job 2 counties east, stayed in motels, avoided open fields. But everywhere he went, he saw teeth. In gravel by the roadside, in the cracks of sidewalks, in the dust by his windshield. He started to hear them too, faintly, clicking in rhythm beneath the floorboards at night. He stuffed towels under doors, blasted music to drown it out. One morning, he woke to find a single tooth on the nightstand beside his bed. Perfectly clean, child-sized. The hotel clerk swore no one had entered his room. He tried throwing it away, flushing it, even driving miles out into the desert to bury it. But the next night, it was back on the pillow beside his head. Months later, someone bought the property in Lubbock again. A construction crew came in to demolish the old house. When they pulled up the concrete, they found the soil dry and packed tight. Nothing unusual, they said, except for the faint white flecks that shimmered under the sun. The foreman thought it was limestone, until one of the workers picked up a handful and saw they weren't stones at all, but teeth. Tiny, endless, still clean as the day they fell. When Julia and her husband bought the little white house on the edge of Huntsville, she thought the creaks and uneven boards were just part of its charm. The place sat on a quiet stretch of 2-lane road just outside the prison district, with tall pine trees surrounding it, and a porch that faced the road. It wasn't new, but it was sturdy, or so she thought. Her husband worked late shifts at the mechanical plant, and Julia spent most of her days trying to make the house feel like home. She painted, cleaned, and planted wildflowers near the mailbox, but the porch always bothered her. Whenever she stepped across the middle boards near the front door, they gave a strange hollow sound, different from the rest. It wasn't just the usual creak of age. It was deeper, more muffled, as if something large was beneath. For weeks she ignored it. She told herself it was probably a gap in the foundation, or maybe an animal burrow, but one afternoon in late September she decided to fix it. The boards had started to dip slightly, and she was tired of catching her toe on the uneven edge. With a pry bar and hammer, she began pulling them up one at a time. Dust rose and the scent of old pine filled the air. Beneath the first few boards was nothing but dirt and cobwebs. But when she pried up the section that had sounded hollow, she froze. It wasn't dirt under there, it was metal. At first, she thought it was maybe a piece of old roofing or an old storage panel left behind by previous owners. But when she brushed the dust off, she saw the handle. It was a ring handle, dark with rust, mounted on what was clearly a trapdoor. The metal was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been in the afternoon heat. She crouched over it, trying to listen. There was nothing. No hum of pipes, no sound of air movement, just silence. Her first thought was that it might lead to an old storm shelter. That wasn't uncommon in old Texas homes. She ran her fingers along the edges, trying to find the seams. It was flush with the foundation. The boards around it looked deliberately placed to cover it, as if someone had built the porch to hide it. When her husband came home that evening, she showed him. He wasn't the type to get spooked by much, but he looked uneasy. They tried to open it together. The handle resisted at first, stiff with rust, but after a few heaves it began to move. The door lifted with a long, aching groan. Beneath it was a square black opening about 3 feet across, leading into darkness. No ladder, no steps, just empty black. Julia shone her phone light into it, expecting to see dirt or concrete, but the light didn't touch anything. It was like shining it into smoke. The beam just ended, swallowed up in nothing. Her husband dropped a small pebble into it. They waited for the sound. It never came. That was the first moment Julia felt the cold. It wasn't just temperature, it was something else, a kind of emptiness that crawled up from the hole. The air around it seemed to pull the warmth out of her skin. Her breath fogged even though it was nearly 90 degrees outside. Her husband said they should cover it up, maybe call someone to inspect it, but she couldn't stop staring. Something about the dark space felt aware, like it knew they had found it. That night she couldn't sleep. The sound of the trees outside the window, the occasional creak of the porch, everything made her sit up and listen. Around midnight, she thought she heard something soft coming from below the floorboards. A faint scraping sound like something moving against wood. She told herself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a possum trapped beneath the porch. Still, she couldn't bring herself to step on the boards that covered it. The next morning, she went out to check. The boards they had pried up were still leaning against the wall. The metal door was closed. She hadn't remembered closing it. When she asked her husband, he said he hadn't touched it either. A few days passed, and Julia noticed strange things around the house. The air felt colder near the porch. The lights in the hallway flickered even though the wiring was new. Sometimes she caught the faint smell of damp earth inside, especially at night. One afternoon she heard what sounded like a knock beneath the porch. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. She ran outside, her heart pounding, but the yard was empty. That evening she convinced herself it was her imagination, stress, maybe even a draft under the boards. But when she checked the porch again, the trapdoor was open. She stood there for a long time, not wanting to get closer. The same cold air seeped from the opening. She tried to call for her husband, but her voice sounded small against the stillness. She leaned forward and whispered, "Is anyone there?" Her phone light flickered as she held it over the hole. For a moment she thought she saw something moving in the dark. Not a shape exactly, more like the faint suggestion of motion. A ripple against blackness. Then her light went out completely. She slammed the trapdoor shut and dragged a heavy chair over it. She told herself she'd seal it the next morning, maybe pour concrete, something to make sure it stayed closed. That night, however, something changed in the house. She woke up just before dawn to a sound from the living room, a low groaning like wood shifting under weight. She stepped out of bed and saw that the hallway light was on. The floorboards creaked softly one after another, leading toward the bedroom. Then it stopped right outside the door. Julia froze. The air smelled like the porch, wet dirt, iron, something faintly metallic. She slowly reached for her phone to turn on the flashlight, but before she could, She heard the sound again. Not footsteps this time, breathing. Slow, shallow, just on the other side of the door. She opened the door fast, light in hand. The hallway was empty. The boards by the living room looked normal, but a small trail of mud marked the path toward the porch. The door leading outside was slightly open, swaying. By morning, her husband had decided enough was enough. They'd get someone from town to take a look, maybe the county inspector or someone from the old property office. When the man arrived, he listened to their story with a polite smile, the kind people give when they think you're overreacting. He said the trapdoor might lead to a crawlspace or an old root cellar. He went out to check. Julia waited by the kitchen window, watching him kneel by the porch. He pulled up the boards, examined the metal door, and gave it a tug. It opened easily this time. He shone his flashlight inside, leaned closer, then frowned. He dropped a small stone in. They waited, no sound. He looked back at Julia, his face pale. "That's not right," he said quietly. "There's no bottom." Before she could respond, his flashlight slipped from his hand and rolled into the opening. It vanished instantly as if swallowed whole. The inspector stood up, shaking his head, muttering something about old sinkholes. But Julia could see the fear in his eyes.
"He told them to seal it immediately, said it was unsafe."
When she asked if it was possible for a sinkhole to stay perfectly silent and cold, he didn't answer. They covered it that evening with plywood and nailed the porch boards back in place. Her husband even poured a bag of cement along the seams. The air felt lighter for a few days, but Julia never stopped thinking about it. 2 weeks later, when her husband went on a night shift, she heard the noise again. Not from beneath the porch this time, but inside the house. A hollow thud from the hallway floor, then another. She grabbed her phone, trembling, and followed the sound. It led to the living room. Right in the middle of the floor, the rug was moving slightly as if air were rising from beneath it. She peeled it back and found a hairline crack in the wood. Cold air breathed through it. And somewhere deep below, she heard the faint echo of a knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. By the time her husband came home, the living room floor was covered in frost, even though the heater had been running all night. The porch boards outside were warped again, and the air around the door was colder than ever. She tried to tell him what she heard, what she felt coming from beneath, but the words sounded absurd. Now, months later, the house sits empty. The neighbors say they moved suddenly, didn't even sell the place. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is still, people driving down that stretch of road claim they can see fog rolling out from under the porch. And if you stop your car and listen, you might hear the faint echo of knocking coming from somewhere far below the boards, where a door still waits in the cold, silent dark. When Mia and her husband Travis bought the old farmhouse off Highway 77, they thought they were getting a bargain. The house sat on a few acres of land surrounded by pecan trees, the kind of rural property Travis had always dreamed of owning. It was quiet, isolated, and carried that worn, nostalgic charm people romanticized about old Texas homes. The realtor mentioned the structure dated back to the late 1800s, built before Waco had paved streets or electric lines, but she assured them it had good bones. The phrase stuck with Mia. She thought about it often as they unpacked boxes, hearing the way the floor groaned when she walked across it, or how the attic seemed to sigh when the wind picked up. They found the doll on the second day. It was in a corner of the cellar, behind an old wine rack covered in cobwebs. The cellar itself was strange. Too cold even for the mild autumn days, the kind of chill that didn't belong in Texas. The rag doll was about a foot tall, wrapped in a strip of burlap tied with twine. Salt clung to it, caked in small white crystals, and the faint smell of something sour clung to its fabric. Its button eyes were different sizes, one black, one brown, and its hair, stiff and yellowed, looked like it had been cut from a real wig. Mia almost didn't touch it, but curiosity outweighed caution. She brushed the salt away and the doll let out a faint sound. It was soft, high-pitched, like the whisper of someone breathing into fabric. Travis laughed it off when she called him down, saying it was probably air-trapped in the burlap or maybe the twine shifting. He didn't even flinch when she said she could swear it had whispered something. "You've been watching too many of your ghost videos again," he said, and went back upstairs. That night the house began to change. The smell came first. It started near the kitchen sink, a faint metallic odor like damp earth and rust. By morning, it had spread through the entire house. Travis said maybe the septic tank was acting up, but when he checked outside, everything looked fine. The odor was strongest in the cellar, where Mia had left the doll sitting on a shelf. She thought about throwing it out but couldn't bring herself to touch it again. When she stood near it, the air felt different, heavier, almost electric, as though something in the room was waiting for her to move. A few nights later, they started hearing the tapping. It came from inside the walls, steady and deliberate, as if someone were walking their fingers through the house. Travis blamed mice, set traps, and grumbled about country living. But the taps didn't stop. They grew louder, shifting from wall to wall, traveling from the attic to the cellar in strange, rhythmic patterns that never repeated. Mia noticed something else. The walls near the cellar door had started to discolor. The paint, once a soft beige, turned dark and wet-looking, almost black. When she pressed her hand against it, moisture bled through, thick and foul-smelling. By the end of the week, the rot had spread. It climbed along the walls like veins, seeping beneath the wallpaper and across the ceiling. Travis said it had to be a leak, maybe from a pipe inside the walls. But the house wasn't plumbed that way. The realtor had shown them the blueprints. One evening, while Travis was outside working on the fence, Mia went down into the cellar again. The doll was gone. Panic tightened her chest as she scanned the shelves. Only a faint outline of salt remained where it had been sitting. Then she saw it, standing upright on the steps behind her. The burlap untied, its head tilted slightly to the side as if studying her. She froze, unable to breathe, her body refusing to move even though her brain screamed to run. The doll whispered again. It wasn't a word exactly, more like the imitation of one, a soft, wet sound that seemed to echo from somewhere deeper inside the walls. The cellar light flickered, and she could see small patches of rot creeping up from the floorboards, spreading outward in dark tendrils. When Travis came back inside, he found her sitting on the floor of the living room, trembling, the cellar door wide open. She couldn't explain what had happened. All she said was that the doll had moved. He didn't believe her, of course, but when he went down to look for himself, he found the floorboards damp and the air thick with the stench of decay. He brought the doll upstairs, saying he'd burn it the next morning. Mia begged him to throw it away right then, but he was stubborn. He left it on the porch table, wrapped again in burlap, and went to bed. Sometime after midnight, the smell got worse. Mia woke to the sound of dripping, steady, rhythmic drops somewhere near the window. She turned on the lamp. The wallpaper had bubbled and torn in long strips, black fluid oozing from beneath. She shook Travis awake, and as he sat up, the floor beneath the bed made a cracking sound. The boards splintered, and for a second she thought the house was collapsing. But then she saw it, the same dark veins spreading across the floor, pulsing faintly like something alive. Travis jumped out of bed, cursing, and ran toward the door. It wouldn't open. The handle turned freely, but the wood frame had swollen, the edges slick with moisture. He kicked it until it gave way, dragging Mia into the hallway. The air smelled like spoiled meat and seawater. Downstairs they could hear something moving, slow and deliberate, like wet fabric dragging across the floor. When Travis reached the bottom of the stairs, the porch door opened by itself. The doll sat in the doorway, its burlap unwrapped, salt scattered around it in a perfect circle. The whisper came again, louder this time. It spoke his name. Clear as day, the voice was that of a child, hoarse, desperate, and somehow ancient. "Travis," it said. "Come home." He froze. The walls began to groan, the sound of wood twisting and cracking under pressure. Paint peeled in long curls, revealing the black rot beneath. The house seemed to breathe, the floorboards rising and falling in shallow waves. Mia screamed for him to get away, but he didn't move. He stared at the doll, his lips trembling. Then he stepped forward. The light bulbs burst one after another, glass raining down as the room fell into darkness. Mia felt something brush her leg, something small and cold. She grabbed for Travis's arm, but her hand closed on air. When the emergency lights flickered back on, he was gone. Only the doll remained, sitting upright where he'd stood, its burlap dry again. The house quieted after that. The smell lingered, but the sound stopped. The next morning, Mia packed her things and left. She didn't even look back as she drove down the dirt road toward Waco. But when she stopped at a gas station outside town, she noticed something strange. Her hands were covered in a thin white residue, salt. She washed them over and over, but the smell clung to her skin. When she got back into the car, the passenger seat was wet. A faint voice came from somewhere near the glove compartment, soft and broken, like something trying to breathe through cloth. She turned off the engine and listened. It whispered her name. Weeks later, The farmhouse was found abandoned. The new owner, who came to inspect it, reported that the interior walls were soft and pulsing, as though waterlogged from the inside. The cellar was sealed, the door swollen shut. When they finally forced it open, they found a circle of salt in the center of the floor. Inside it sat a rag doll, perfectly dry, its head tilted toward the stairs. Its button eyes were different colors. Its lips, crudely stitched with black thread, had been pulled apart, as if something inside had forced them open to speak. The house has been empty ever since. People who drive past at night say they can hear faint whispers coming from the front porch, carried on the wind, calling out names that no one recognizes. And sometimes when it rains, the ground around the old house steams. The grass never grows there anymore, but the salt does. Under the wide Texas sky, the town of Kerrville always seemed calm from a distance. The Guadalupe River shimmered in the daylight. Cicadas hummed through the afternoons, and nights fell over the oaks and limestone in a kind of peaceful hush. But peace has its cracks, and sometimes it's what leaks through them that makes people move away without saying why. The old house on the edge of Harper Road was one of those cracks. It had been empty for nearly 8 years when the Morgan family bought it, convinced the stories were just small-town folklore. The realtor had brushed off the tales as good local color and warned them only about the foundation being old and the porch needing repair. Still, when they moved in, the first thing that caught their attention wasn't the creaking boards or the chipped paint. It was the tiny iron bell hanging on the underside of the porch. It was small, unassuming, and cold to the touch. Lauren Morgan was the first to notice it. She had crouched under the porch to look at the lattice, checking for signs of animal burrows. When her fingers brushed the bell, it gave off a dull chime, soft but sharp enough to send a tremor through the quiet morning air. It wasn't attached to any visible wire or string, just a small rusted thing hanging beneath one of the beams. When she told her husband, Daniel, he joked that it must have been a cat collar or an old service bell someone nailed there for decoration. But that night, when the clock on the living room mantel hit midnight, the sound came again. A soft, clear ring, once, twice, then silence. Daniel was half asleep when he heard it. He sat up, listening. It came again, more faint this time, but unmistakable. He got out of bed, walked barefoot to the porch, and stood in the dark. The bell wasn't moving. The night air was still, the trees barely swaying. He waited there for 5 minutes, maybe 10, before shrugging it off as a trick of the wind. The next morning, he checked under the porch again. The bell was there, still, unmoving, but the ground beneath it looked freshly disturbed, like someone, or something, had dug shallowly and smoothed it back over. He told himself it was raccoons. Over the next week, the ringing continued, always at midnight, never at any other time. The sound was delicate but piercing, like something made to be heard only by those awake enough to notice it. Lauren started keeping track, writing down the time, the duration, even the weather. It didn't matter if it rained or if the wind howled. The bell rang every single night like clockwork. On the 6th night, she decided to wait for it outside. She sat on the porch steps with a flashlight, Daniel watching from inside the living room window. Midnight came. The air felt heavy, thick with humidity and the distant hum of crickets. When the bell rang, it sounded right beneath her feet. She bent down, shining the light through the cracks in the boards. Something glinted faintly in the dirt like metal, but it was gone before she could focus. She called Daniel out. Together, they pulled up 2 planks from the porch floor and dug beneath where the sound had come from. But the only thing they found was an old nail, rusted through, and a few shards of what looked like broken pottery. They covered it back up, but that night the ringing was louder. 2 days later, their dog, Scout, started acting strange. He refused to go near the porch, barking and growling whenever they opened the front door. He'd stare at the space beneath it, hackles raised, tail between his legs. On the 10th night, Scout's barking stopped abruptly at midnight. When Daniel went outside to check, the dog was gone. He searched the yard, the woods, the ditch across the road, but found nothing. The next morning, when he stepped out onto the porch, he saw a shallow indentation in the dirt below the bell, like something had lain there for a long time. Lauren was convinced there was something under the porch, something old. She called a local historian who dealt with Civil War relics and grave sites. The man, a wiry fellow named Travis Hall, came by that afternoon. He crawled under the porch, examined the bell, and frowned. "That's a hand-cast piece," he said. 19th century, easy. Looks like something used in funerary rituals. People used to bury bells with caskets in case someone woke up after being declared dead. Lauren felt a chill. Like those safety coffins? She asked. Exactly, he said. They'd run a cord from the coffin lid to a bell above ground. Person wakes up, they ring it. He looked around the dirt, brushing away leaves. You said it rings every night? She nodded. He swallowed and stood up fast. Then you should leave this alone. He packed his tools and left without another word. That night, the ringing didn't come at midnight. It came at 11:55. Lauren woke to the sound and shook Daniel awake. They both listened. The ringing was faster this time, frantic, like someone was shaking it violently. It went on for almost a full minute. Then silence. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and went outside again. The bell was swinging wildly, even though the air was completely still. He reached toward it, but before he could touch it, the beam of his flashlight caught something else. What looked like a handprint in the dirt directly below the bell. Small, pale, and unmistakably human. He backed away, heart hammering, and went inside. They locked the doors, closed the curtains, and barely slept. The next morning, the handprint was gone. The ground looked freshly smoothed again. They decided to leave for a few days, drive up to Austin to stay with Lauren's sister. But when Daniel went to load their suitcases into the truck, he heard the faintest jingle behind him. He turned and saw something small resting on the porch step. It was Scout's collar. The bell attached to it was missing. They left that afternoon, but Daniel couldn't stop thinking about it. He called a local contractor, told him to tear up the porch completely and to call when the job was done. On the third day, the contractor called. His voice was shaky. Sir, I think you need to see this for yourself. When Daniel returned, the porch was gone. In its place was a shallow pit about 4 feet deep. At the bottom of it lay an old wooden board, rotted but still showing a faint carved design. It was a coffin lid. The bell, the same one that had been hanging beneath the porch, lay right on top of it. Daniel told them to fill it back up. He didn't want to see what was underneath. That night, after they returned to Austin, he woke up around midnight. For a moment, he thought he heard the faintest ringing sound, distant and muffled, coming from outside the window. He told himself it was in his head. But when Lauren got up the next morning, she found something on the windowsill. A small rusted iron bell, the same one from Kerrville. They moved soon after, selling the property back to the bank. The listing stayed up for nearly 2 years before it disappeared quietly, with no record of a new owner. But every once in a while, when the wind shifts over Harper Road, the neighbors swear they can hear a faint metallic chime drifting through the night, and those who walk too close say the sound doesn't fade, it follows. It started when Claire moved into the yellow house on Pine Street, the one tucked behind the old pecan tree that leaned so far over the roof it looked ready to crash down in the next storm. She had come to Beaumont for quiet, after the divorce, after her father's passing, after the years in Houston that had stripped her nerves raw. The house was small, dated, and smelled faintly of cedar and mildew, but it was hers. It was the kind of place you could listen to yourself think, she'd told the realtor. That was before the first envelope appeared. It was on her porch one morning, balanced neatly on the welcome mat, though she hadn't ordered anything and no one ever came down that street. The return address was blank and her own name, Claire Simmons, was written across the front in perfect cursive, the kind that looked like it belonged to someone born long before her time. The oddest part, though, was the date on the postmark, October 2035. She blinked at it, thinking maybe it was a smudge, but it was clear as day, 10 years into the future. She laughed at first, assuming it was a prank, maybe some strange art project. But when she opened it, her smile faded. Inside was a single page of lined paper, aged yellow and brittle at the edges, though the ink looked fresh. "Don't dig," it said. Not under the tree, no signature, no explanation. Claire stared at the message, uneasy but not yet frightened. She placed it on the counter and forgot about it for most of the day. But that night, as she sat reading in the small living room, the house creaked differently. The wind brushed through the pecan branches like something whispering, and the faint scrape of wood against wood seemed to come from beneath the floor. She told herself old houses made noise, but when she went to bed, she dreamed of the tree outside, its roots twisting through dark soil, wrapping around something pale. The second envelope came 3 days later. Same cursive, same blank return address, same strange postmark. This one read, "You didn't listen." He doesn't like to be uncovered. Her skin prickled. She hadn't dug anything, hadn't even gone near the tree since the first letter. She checked her phone, scrolling for any explanation. Neighbors pulling a prank, viral marketing stunt, something. Nothing came up. She placed the envelope in a drawer and told herself it was just a coincidence. The third letter arrived a week later. This time it was thicker, heavier, and she nearly didn't open it. But curiosity was stronger than fear. Inside was a photograph, an old Polaroid, faded and slightly bent. It showed her own porch, but the wood looked older, cracked and darker. There was someone sitting on the steps, back turned to the camera. A man by the shape of him. In the corner of the image, a small date stamp, October 24th, 2035. And below it, scrawled in the same handwriting, were the words, "He's already waiting." Claire sat at her table for a long time staring at that photograph. The air in the kitchen felt colder than it should, even with the afternoon sun coming through the window. She stood and went to the front door, opening it slowly, expecting to see someone out there. The street was empty. The tree swayed, and she could hear the faint groan of its branches shifting against the shingles. That night she called her ex-husband, Mark, just to hear a familiar voice. He laughed off her story, called it small-town paranoia. Probably some teenager with a printer, he said. But he didn't sound entirely sure. She wanted him to come visit, to take a look, but he brushed it off and said she needed to relax. The fourth envelope came that same night, delivered without a sound. She found it wedged under the front door at dawn. Her name again. The handwriting had started to wobble, as if whoever was writing it had grown weaker. The message inside said, "You'll hear him breathing soon." Claire nearly dropped it. She looked toward the window. The yard was damp with morning dew, but something had pressed deep footprints into the soil. Bare feet. Large ones. Too large for any child. They led from the base of the tree straight to her porch, then vanished as if whoever left them had simply stopped existing at her door. She called the sheriff's office that afternoon. A deputy came by, a middle-aged man named Holloway, who treated her kindly but skeptically. He looked at the letters, frowned at the postmarks, then said they could have been printed. "You'd be surprised what folks can fake these days," he said. When she showed him the footprints, they were gone, washed away by the rain. By the fifth letter, Claire had stopped pretending this was a prank. It came late one night, the soft slap of paper on the porch jerking her awake. She froze in bed, listening. The wind had died completely. She could hear only her own breathing. Slowly, she got up, grabbed the flashlight from her dresser, and walked barefoot to the front door. She opened it and aimed the beam at the porch. The letter sat there, pale against the dark boards. But beyond it, in the yard, she saw something else. Movement near the tree. A figure, faint, half hidden in the shadows. She could make out only a shoulder, the back of a head. The beam flickered. When it steadied, the figure was gone. The new envelope was damp. Inside, one word was written in uneven strokes. "Tonight." That was when Claire lost control. She packed a bag, threw it in her car, and drove toward town, headlights cutting through the black fields. She didn't stop until she reached a gas station off Highway 90. The clerk there, a young woman with tired eyes, asked if she was all right. Claire started to explain, then stopped. What could she say? That someone from the future was sending her warnings about a tree. She stayed in a cheap motel that night, wide awake until dawn. When she returned the next morning, she almost didn't recognize her house. The front yard was torn up, soil turned over as though by heavy machinery. The tree's roots lay exposed, thick and pale, twisting like veins. The air smelled of wet earth and rot. Someone, or something, had dug deep beneath it. Claire's knees went weak. She called the sheriff again, her voice shaking. But when Deputy Holloway arrived an hour later, the yard was pristine, undisturbed. Not a single mark of digging. He gave her a long, worried look before leaving her with a number for a good local therapist. That night, Claire burned the letters. She sat on the back porch with a lighter and a small metal tray, feeding each one to the flame. The paper curled and blackened, the ink turning gray as smoke twisted upward. She whispered to herself that it was over. But the next morning, the tray was empty, clean, like nothing had been burned at all. And sitting where the ashes should have been was another envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. This one wasn't dated 2035, it was dated October 2034, only 9 years ahead now. Inside was a photograph of her backyard, taken from above, maybe from the roof. The soil beneath the pecan tree had been dug up again, and at the center of the hole was something unmistakably human, curled and half-buried. The handwriting below the image was almost illegible now, shaky, desperate. "You shouldn't have stayed." That night she slept with the lights on. The sound of breathing woke her just before dawn. Low, steady, too close. She turned her head toward the doorway, but no one was there. She could still hear it coming from the floor deep beneath the bed. When Deputy Holloway came by the next afternoon for a welfare check, the house was empty. Her car was still in the driveway, her purse on the table, phone plugged into the wall. Everything looked undisturbed except for the stack of sealed envelopes neatly arranged on the counter. Each addressed to Claire Simmons, each one dated 1 year closer to the present. The top one, stamped October 2025, just days away, had been left open. Inside, in handwriting that matched every previous letter, were the words, "I told you not to dig." And beneath that line, faint and smeared, was a fingerprint pressed in dried soil. When Sarah moved into the small one-story house off Old League Line Road in Conroe, she thought it would be the perfect escape from Houston's noise. The property was simple but charming, with a sagging wooden porch, 2 pecan trees shading the front yard, and the faint smell of rain-soaked soil that seemed to linger even when the weather was dry. It had that quiet Texas stillness she'd been craving. The real estate agent told her the house was built in 1976 and had gone through a few owners since, mostly older couples who had lived quietly until moving or passing away. Sarah liked that it wasn't new. She liked its creaks and its slightly uneven floors. It felt honest, lived in, and harmless. The first few nights she slept deeply for the first time in years. A week later, while cleaning under the porch to clear out the leaves and debris, she found something strange. Tucked into the dirt near the foundation was a crumpled piece of clear plastic with something inside it. She assumed it was trash until she peeled it open and saw a Polaroid photograph, faded but still sharp enough to make her heart tighten. The picture showed a woman asleep in bed, blankets pulled up to her chest, hair spread across the pillow. The camera angle was wrong, too close, too intimate, as if taken from the corner of the room. It took her only a few seconds to realize it was her. The quilt, the bedside lamp, the chipped dresser, they were all hers. Even the small water stain on the ceiling above her head matched. The picture had been taken in her bedroom, probably just a few nights earlier. She dropped the photo and stumbled backward, dirt clinging to her knees. For a long minute, she could only stare at the Polaroid, waiting for her brain to offer a rational explanation. Maybe the previous owner had a daughter who looked like her. Maybe it was an old photo that coincidentally matched her room. She forced herself to pick it up again, holding it closer to the light that seeped through the porch slats, but there was no mistaking it. The digital clock on her nightstand in the photo read 2:43. The time was recent. The model was one she'd bought 2 months ago at Walmart. Someone had been in her house while she slept. That night, Sarah didn't go to bed. She kept all the lights on and sat in the living room with her phone clutched in her hand, watching the dark hallway leading to her bedroom. The house seemed to creak more than usual. Once, around midnight, she heard the porch boards flex softly like someone had stepped on them. She stood and stared at the window, but when she finally found the courage to pull the curtain aside, no one was there. Only the yard, quiet and still under the moonlight. She locked the doors again, checked the windows twice, and waited for dawn. The next morning, she called the local police. The officer, a tired man with sun-leathered skin, looked over the photo and frowned. "This looks recent," he said, then glanced up at her. "You sure this isn't a prank? Maybe a friend messing with you?" She told him she lived alone, had just moved in, and barely knew anyone in Conroe. He shrugged, said he'd make a note of it, and advised her to install cameras and get better locks. Before leaving, he added, "It's probably nothing. Sometimes these old houses turn up weird things." Sarah installed a motion camera that evening, one of those cheap Wi-Fi models that sync to her phone. She aimed it down the hallway, facing her bedroom door. The first night it captured nothing but dust specks drifting through the air. The second night, the feed froze at 2:43 a.m. When she checked it the next morning, the footage ended abruptly with a flicker of static. No sound, no movement, just silence and then black. She tried to replay it multiple times, but each time the app crashed at the same moment. That afternoon, she found a second Polaroid. It was lying on her kitchen counter, perfectly centered as if placed there deliberately, The photo showed her again sitting on the couch watching TV. The image was clear, bright, and unmistakably recent. She was wearing the same t-shirt she had on last night. She ran outside, heart pounding, scanning the yard for anyone hiding. The neighbors were a good 50 yards away, and the street beyond the pecan trees was empty. She called the police again. This time they sent 2 officers. They searched the house, checked the locks, even looked under the crawl space, but found nothing. "No signs of forced entry," one of them said. "You sure you didn't leave a door unlocked?" She insisted she hadn't. They left her with a polite but unconvinced expression. That night she pushed her dresser in front of the bedroom door. She turned on the hallway light and left it glowing through the crack under the door. For hours she lay awake, listening. The pecan branches scraped softly against the roof. A train wailed in the distance, somewhere toward the north tracks. Around 3 a.m., just when her eyelids began to droop, she heard something faint. It wasn't footsteps or creaking wood this time, it was a quiet, mechanical sound. A soft click. The kind a Polaroid camera makes when it captures an image. She sat up, frozen. Another click, closer now. The sound came from the hallway, then another. 3 slow, deliberate snaps in the darkness. She didn't move until the first light of morning leaked through the window. When she finally gathered the nerve to open her bedroom door, the hallway light was off. On the floor near the baseboard were 3 Polaroid pictures, each still faintly warm to the touch. The first showed her sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open. The second captured her half out of bed, staring toward the doorway. The third, blurred but unmistakable, was taken from inside the room just a few feet away from her. She could see her own face in motion mid-turn. Whoever took it had been right there. She packed her things that morning and drove to a friend's apartment in the Woodlands. She refused to go back, but she still called a locksmith to change every lock and bolt on the property just in case. The locksmith, a chatty old man, told her he'd seen plenty of strange things in houses that old. "Sometimes it's the previous owners sneaking back," he said. "People get attached." She didn't reply. She just wanted it done. 2 weeks later, after convincing herself it had all been some deranged prank, she returned briefly to collect a few boxes she'd left behind. The house smelled musty, as if the air hadn't moved in days. The porch creaked beneath her feet. She noticed something odd right away. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it except for one thing. Lying on the coffee table was a stack of Polaroids neatly arranged, a dozen or more. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through them. The first few were the same old shots, her sleeping, watching TV, brushing her hair in the mirror. But the last one made her knees go weak. It wasn't of her. It showed a man, crouched in the attic crawl space above her bedroom, grinning down through a vent. His eyes were wide and empty, his mouth stretched into a smile that didn't look human. Behind him, the space was filled with Polaroid photos taped to the beams, hundreds of them, all showing her from different angles. She dropped the stack and ran. As she reached her car, she heard something fall inside the house, a thud like a foot hitting the floor. She didn't look back. She drove straight to a motel and called the police again, her voice shaking. They searched the attic that night, but found it empty. No photos, no man, no sign anyone had been there. The officers didn't even find the stack of Polaroids she'd left on the table. Sarah sold the house within a month to a retired couple from Houston, who wanted a quiet place near the lake. The night before the sale closed, she received a text from an unknown number. Attached was a photo. It was a Polaroid image, grainy but unmistakable. Her, asleep in a motel bed. The timestamp in the corner read 2:43. When the jar came up through the dirt, it made a faint popping sound like air escaping a bottle. Daniel dropped his trowel and leaned closer, brushing away the loose soil. The thing was half the size of a football, cloudy glass crusted with mud and roots that looked too much like veins. Inside, through the haze of dirt and condensation, he saw what looked like water. But it wasn't just water. Small pale shapes floated within it, curling at the edges like bits of paper or petals. He touched the jar, and a jolt of warmth went through his hand. It wasn't sunlight. The glass was warm. That was what made him pull back. He wiped his fingers on his jeans and looked toward the house. The late afternoon light hung low over Elgin, turning the yard a shade of dying gold. The old farmhouse he'd bought last spring sat quiet, the porch sagging on one side, the grass high enough to hide copperheads. He'd come out here to clear space for a garden, but this was something else. He dug around the edges carefully, and as the jar came free, he saw it had been wrapped once in a dark cloth that disintegrated in his fingers. The lid was rusted but still sealed tight. The jar pulsed faintly with warmth, like holding something alive. His dog Scout barked from the porch, tail low, ears back. That bark meant unease. Daniel stood, wiping his palms again. He told himself it was probably an old preserving jar, maybe some homemade brine or oil from whoever had owned this land before. But fingernails, he could see them clearly now, curling white bits suspended in murky water. He counted at least a dozen. By the time the sun sank, he had found 5 more, each jar buried in a neat pattern along the edge of the yard, spaced maybe 3 feet apart, all about a foot deep. Every one of them was warm to the touch. The same dull clouded glass, the same cloudy liquid, the same pale contents. He stacked them on the porch steps, and the air around them smelled faintly of salt and iron. Scout wouldn't go near them. That night he didn't sleep well. The house, with its single ceiling fan and faint rot smell in the walls, never felt quite settled. Wind moaned softly through the fields outside, and somewhere near midnight something tapped against the siding. Once, then again. The third time it sounded deliberate, almost polite, like a knock. He got up barefoot, grabbed his flashlight, and went to the front door. The yard was empty. The beam caught the jars lined along the porch rail. The condensation inside them had thickened, running in rivulets down the glass. He could have sworn one of them vibrated just slightly, like something moving in the water. By morning, the warmth had spread. The wood beneath the jars was damp, darkened by some kind of leak. The water in the jars had gone from clear to faintly yellow, and the fingernails, there were more now. Dozens, small and large, all suspended like a macabre collection. He tried opening one. The lid came off with effort, releasing a hiss of trapped air and a sour metallic odor that burned his nose. The water inside was almost hot. He dumped it out onto the dirt. Steam rose faintly in the morning light, curling upward. The fingernails landed with a soft clatter like dry leaves. He filled the hole back in. He thought that would be the end of it. But the next morning, another jar sat by the porch steps, not one he had dug up. This one was clean, no mud, no rust. It gleamed in the sun, almost new. The water inside was still. He checked the yard for footprints, thinking maybe some kids were messing with him. There were none. He took the jars to the edge of the property that afternoon near the mesquite line and buried them again. He went deeper this time, 4 feet down, and covered the hole carefully. He didn't tell anyone, not yet. That night the tapping came again, louder. A hollow rhythm against the walls, like someone dragging fingernails down the siding. Scout growled low, his hackles up. Daniel waited in the dark, listening, his heart thudding against the mattress. The sound stopped. Then from the kitchen came the faint clink of glass. He went in slow, flashlight trembling. The jars were lined neatly on the counter. Lids gone, water seeping across the wood like sweat. He froze. The air was heavy with that same salt iron smell. In the beam's circle, the fingernails looked fresh. Pink at the base, still moist. One floated to the edge of a jar and stuck there as if pressed from the inside. The next morning, he drove into town. He asked around the hardware store about the property's old owners. A man named Daryl behind the counter scratched his chin and said, "That was the Simmons place, right? They left after the fire. Wife and kid didn't make it. House been sitting near empty since." Fire. He hadn't seen signs of that, maybe long ago before the last coat of paint. He asked where they were buried. Daryl pointed him toward a little churchyard past County Road 170. He went that afternoon. The graves were there, husband, wife, and a girl. Fresh flowers on 2, nothing on the 3rd. The girl's stone was chipped, the name barely legible. Martha, age 9. Someone had scratched a faint circle beneath the dates like a ring. That night the jars were waiting by his bed. 6 of them. He didn't remember bringing them in. He didn't remember much after driving home. The air was humid, thick with a smell like burnt hair. The fingernails inside the jars had grown into thin, pale ribbons, twisting together like roots. He picked one up and the water trembled. He dreamed of a little girl standing in the yard, her hands folded, nails chewed to the quick. She whispered without sound. He woke to find dirt under his fingernails and a 7th jar on the floor beside him. He called the sheriff the next day, told him about the jars, about finding them buried. The man came out, looked them over, and said it was probably some kind of old ritual. Maybe hoodoo or folk medicine. Nothing to worry about. They took one jar as evidence. Daniel watched their cruiser disappear down the road. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. He found the sheriff's cruiser abandoned at dawn, about half a mile down the road. No sign of the man, just a smear of mud across the driver's door and the jar missing from the seat. The house began to change after that. The walls stayed damp. The lights flickered. He started hearing scratching from under the floorboards. When he pulled one up, the dirt beneath was dark and wet, breathing faintly. He dropped the board and nailed it back down. By the fifth night, the warmth had spread through the house completely. The air shimmered like heat waves. He walked through the kitchen and found every jar open, every one empty. The sound of dripping came from the hallway, steady and rhythmic. When he reached the end, the attic door hung open. Water dripped from above, dark and thick. He climbed the ladder. In the attic, he found the girl again, pale, hair matted with soil, standing barefoot beside a circle drawn in salt. Around her, a dozen more jars sat glowing faintly. She looked at him and lifted her hand. Her fingernails were gone. She opened her mouth and whispered something he didn't understand, and all at once the jars began to hum. He woke on the floor at dawn, drenched in cold sweat. The attic was empty, but his own hands, his fingernails were gone, the tips raw and bleeding lightly. He packed a bag and left that morning. The house behind him sagged in the mist. When he reached town, he stopped at a gas station and washed his hands. The water turned cloudy, swirling with thin white shavings. He lifted his eyes to the mirror above the sink and saw her behind him, faintly reflected, small and still. A month later, the house went on the market again. The real estate listing said, "Cozy historic property needs some restoration." The pictures showed the yard looking freshly dug, the grass sparse. If you looked close, you could see the top of a single mason jar, half buried, gleaming faintly in the sunlight. When the church on Lanana Street was demolished, the only thing the workers found intact beneath the rubble was a Bible. It wasn't a new one by any stretch. Its leather was cracked, the edges of the cover curled like burnt paper, and the gold lettering on the front had long faded into dull scratches. One of the volunteers, a man named Jesse Warren, picked it up and brushed the dust away with his thumb. He thought it might look good on a shelf in his small house just outside Nacogdoches, near the old pines where the fog liked to hang low over the road in the evenings. The church had been closed for decades, ever since a fire in the 1970s took half the roof off and burned the rest black. Nobody had claimed the land in all that time. Jesse didn't think much of the find. To him, it was just an artifact, a relic from a forgotten congregation. When he opened it, he saw nothing but blank pages, hundreds of them smooth and yellowed with age. No verses, no names, no signatures, just emptiness. He left it on his kitchen counter that night. The sun went down around 7, and he sat out on his porch drinking a beer and listening to the cicadas hum their endless hollow song. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to skin and turned every sound into a whisper. He didn't go back inside until near midnight, when the woods had gone silent and even the bugs seemed to hold their breath. That's when he saw it, the Bible sitting open on its own, a faint glimmer of wet ink across the pages. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but when he leaned closer, he saw the words were moving, shaping themselves in real time, curling from invisible strokes as if written by an unseen hand. The letters were dark and still glistening, fresh enough to smear if touched. He read a line and froze. It said, "He stands by your porch now." Jesse turned toward the screen door, his heart thudding. The porch was empty. Beyond it, the yard fell into darkness, the fence barely visible against the trees. He tried to laugh it off, telling himself someone must have written that before, some prankster in the demolition crew. Maybe the ink just hadn't shown in the light before. He closed the Bible and went to bed, leaving it face down on the counter. When morning came, the ink was gone. The pages were blank again, the same lifeless beige as before. But when he flipped through them, he noticed faint indentations as if someone had pressed a heavy pen into the paper. He could feel the grooves under his fingers. They spelled the same words, though now colorless and silent. That day, Jesse told his co-worker, an older man named Tom, about it. Tom had grown up around Nacogdoches his whole life and knew the town's history better than most. When Jesse described the book, Tom frowned and said he remembered something. Back in the early 1980s, a preacher named Milton Clay had taken over the church on Lanana Street. Folks said he was different, quiet, intense, always preaching about visions and prophecies, claiming the Lord spoke directly to him through scripture. One night, Clay had called a midnight sermon insisting that the world would change before dawn. The congregation gathered, waiting for a sign. But by morning, the doors were locked and no one inside ever came out. When police broke in days later, they found the pews burned, the pulpit smashed, and the altar soaked in something dark and sticky that wasn't quite blood but wasn't paint either. There was no trace of Clay or his parishioners. Only that Bible was missing, and some said it was the reason the fire started. Jesse laughed it off, though not easily. He told Tom he'd bring it by that night so they could look at it together. But when evening came, he couldn't find it. It wasn't on the counter or on the shelf or anywhere in the kitchen. He tore through the house for nearly an hour before giving up. He sat down, trying to shake the unease that had settled in his stomach. Then as the light faded, he heard something faint, a wet scratching sound coming from the living room. He turned on the lamp. The Bible sat on the coffee table, open wide. Its pages gleamed. The smell of fresh ink hung in the air, sharp and metallic. This time the words stretched across both pages, written in looping script. "Do not turn away," it read. "He walks when you do." Jesse slammed it shut and ran outside. He didn't look back until he reached the driveway, his chest heaving. The woods were motionless, thick with darkness. The only sound was his own breathing and the quiet rustle of the trees. When he finally went back inside, the Bible was gone again. He stayed awake till dawn, the lights on in every room. By morning, he convinced himself it had all been some kind of hallucination. Maybe someone was breaking in, playing tricks on him. He installed a motion light above the porch and a cheap security camera pointed at the front door. That night he set the Bible, found again on the counter as if it had never vanished beneath the camera's view. He sat by the window with a mug of coffee, waiting. The words appeared at 12:23 a.m. sharp. The ink moved across the page in real time as if dragged by a hand he couldn't see. He read behind the glass. Jesse froze and turned his head toward the window. At first he saw only his reflection. Then behind it something else, tall, gray, and faintly human-shaped. Its face was like wet paper, pale and featureless except for two dark slits where eyes should have been. He fell backward, knocking over the lamp. The lights went out. When he scrambled to the switch, nothing happened. He didn't remember falling asleep, but when he woke, the sun was up and the Bible was shut again. The footage on his camera was blank. Not blank as in no motion, blank as in missing. The files between midnight and sunrise were gone. Over the next few days he tried burning it, but the fire wouldn't catch. He tried soaking it, but the water beat it off the cover like oil. Finally, he drove out past the loop, down a dirt road that cut into the woods and buried it under a fallen oak. He didn't say a word about it to anyone. For a few weeks things went quiet. The nights were normal again. Then one morning, while driving to work, he passed the old church site. The demolition crew had cleared most of the debris, leaving only the stone foundation and a mound of ash where the altar had been. And sitting right there at the edge of the rubble was the Bible, open. The wind caught its pages, and for a second he saw them flash with ink, dark and alive. He slammed the brakes and stared, his hands shaking on the wheel. He didn't go near it. He went straight home, packed a bag, and drove to Lufkin to stay with his sister. She said he looked pale, thinner, and kept glancing out the windows. That night, while she slept, he checked his phone to review his home security footage, just to see if anything had happened since he left. The video loaded fine until midnight. Then the screen filled with static. When it cleared, the view showed his living room. The camera was moving like someone was carrying it, and in the center of the frame sat the Bible, open. The words were visible this time, shaky but legible. "Too late," it read. "You read it." The footage ended there. The next morning, Jesse's truck was found parked near the old church foundation. The driver's door was open, the keys still in the ignition. They never found him. But people still talk about that Bible. Sometimes hikers say they've seen it propped against a tree near the creek, pages fluttering in the wind even when the air is still. And if you wait until after sunset, they say the words come back, the same ones every time, written in ink that never dries. "He stands by your porch now." The rope was found behind the shed the morning after the storm, half buried in the mud, coiled tight like it had been placed there deliberately. Clay hadn't noticed it the night before, not when he went out to check the damage from the wind or when he walked the fence line with a flashlight. But now it sat there pale and soaked, the color of old bone, resting like something sleeping. When he touched it, it was cold and slick. Not like a normal rope at all, and the strangest thing was that it smelled faintly of iron, the sharp metallic tang of blood. He thought it might have come from a tree or a neighbor's barn that got torn up in the storm. He almost tossed it into the fire pit to burn with the other debris, but something made him hesitate. It didn't feel right to throw it away. It felt heavy with a kind of wrongness he couldn't explain. He left it by the porch instead, washed the mud off with the hose and hung it over the rail to dry. When his wife Lydia came out later that morning with coffee, she frowned at it immediately. "Where'd you get that thing?" she asked. Clay shrugged. "Found it by the shed. Probably washed in from one of the old ranches." Lydia stepped closer and touched it with one finger. "It's wet," she said, pulling her hand back. "It's been in the sun for 2 hours." She rubbed her fingers together, then stared at them. There was a faint pink stain on her skin like diluted blood. "What the hell?" Clay took the rope down again and laid it across the picnic table. It didn't look special, just old hemp or cotton, frayed in spots, stiff in others. But the fibers were discolored, as if they'd soaked up something more than water. He fetched his knife and sliced a short piece off to check inside. The blade met resistance, like cutting through sinew. When it finally gave way, a thin bead of red welled up from the fresh cut and ran down the groove. Lydia gasped. Clay just stared, thinking maybe it was rust or dye, something chemical. But when he wiped it with a paper towel, the stain smeared dark, unmistakably blood. Fresh, wet blood. He didn't say much after that. He wrapped the piece in paper and put it in a Ziploc bag, meaning to drive it to town and show it to the sheriff. But he never did. That afternoon, while he was fixing the downed fence, he looked back toward the porch and froze. The rope was gone. The table was empty except for a few damp marks. He went inside, asked Lydia if she'd moved it. She said she hadn't touched it. They searched around the yard, the barn, the ditch, even the truck bed. Nothing. It had vanished like it had never been there. That night the air was heavy with the smell of rain, even though the storm had passed. The dog, a mutt named Jasper, wouldn't go near the back door. Around midnight, Clay woke to the sound of something dragging across the porch boards, slow and deliberate, like something being pulled by hand. He lay still, listening. Then came a soft tap against the screen door. Not hard, just enough to make the latch rattle. When he looked, there was nothing there. He stepped outside barefoot, the wood cool beneath his feet. The air felt thick and wet. In the dim porch light, he saw a faint red smear across the table leading down the steps. He followed it with the flashlight, through the grass, past the garden, all the way to the shed. The door was open, swinging gently. Inside, hanging from the rafter, was the rope. It was coiled at the top, but dangling down in a noose-like loop. A dark puddle had formed beneath it. Clay didn't go closer. He could smell it again. The blood. The sourness of something long dead. He turned, locked the shed, and came back to the house. He didn't tell Lydia what he saw. The next morning, the shed was locked, but the rope was gone again. Clay checked the rafters. Empty. The floor was dry, no puddle, no stain. He began to wonder if he'd dreamed it. Lydia noticed how quiet he'd gotten. She thought maybe the storm had rattled him. She didn't see what he saw later that day when he went to the edge of their property and found the rope hanging from an oak tree near the creek, swinging gently even though the wind was still. That night he brought it inside against his better judgment. He laid it in the garage, locked the door, and told himself he'd drive it into town first thing in the morning. But sometime before dawn, Lydia woke to find him gone. She found him standing in the garage, staring at the workbench. The rope was spread out across it like it had been arranged by careful hands. It was longer now, or maybe it just seemed that way in the dim light. Each coil was darker, almost black and wet again. Clay's hands were shaking. "It bleeds," he said softly. "Every time I cut it, it bleeds." Lydia didn't know what to do. She begged him to leave it alone, to just throw it away, so he did. They took it down to the creek and tossed it in, watching it drift like a pale snake through the dark water. It didn't sink. It floated away slowly until it disappeared behind the trees. Clay stood there long after Lydia went back inside. 2 days later, he was out mowing the back pasture when the mower hit something and stalled. When he got down to check, he saw it again, coiled tight beneath the blades, streaked with dirt and grass, but unmistakable. The rope, he didn't touch it this time. He just walked away, left the mower where it was. That night he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the sound of the dragging again, the slow scrape against the boards. By the weekend, Lydia called her brother Tom to come help. Tom was a big man, ex-Marine, didn't believe in anything he couldn't shoot. He went out to the barn that night with a flashlight and a shotgun. When he came back, he was pale. He told Clay to stay inside and call the sheriff. "It's hanging out there," he said. "From the rafter. Like someone tied it themselves." "Only," he trailed off, "only it's dripping." The sheriff came out from Bastrop that night. He was a friend of Clay's, used to weird calls from rural folks. He laughed at first until he saw the rope. He touched it with his boot, frowned, then cut a small section to take for testing. When his knife sliced through, a thin stream of red ran down his hand. He stared at it, speechless. "That ain't possible," he muttered. He took the sample in a plastic bag and left. They never heard back from him. When Clay went into town the next day, the sheriff's office was closed, lights off. The deputy said the sheriff had gone home sick. Clay didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. By then, the rope had started to move on its own. At first, it was subtle, a shift on the floor, a coil tightening slightly when no one touched it. Then one morning, Lydia found it wrapped around the porch post, knotted tight, leaving grooves in the wood. She screamed for Clay, and when he came out, the rope was still moving, tightening itself as if choking the post. He hacked at it with an axe until the fibers split, and again the blood came, bright and hot. That night, Lydia packed a bag. She said she was leaving, going to her sister's. Clay didn't argue. He just stood in the kitchen, staring at the trail of red drops leading from the porch into the house. The next morning, the truck was still in the driveway. The bag was in the back seat. Lydia was gone. Clay searched the house, the yard, the creek. Nothing. He called her phone until it went to voicemail. When he finally checked the shed again, he found the rope coiled neatly in the corner, and hanging from the rafter above it was one long strand, ending in a loop. Beneath it, a single wet footprint. When the deputies came later, they didn't find any sign of Lydia. The rope was gone again. Clay told them the truth, but they didn't believe him. They called it shock. They said maybe she left on her own. Weeks passed. The house grew quiet still. Clay stopped sleeping. He stopped answering the phone. Neighbors said they saw him standing in the yard at night, staring toward the shed. One night, they heard the dog barking and then nothing. The next morning, the dog was found lying by the porch, neck bruised, tongue out. A few days later, Clay's truck was still in the drive, but he wasn't answering the door. The deputies broke in and found the place empty. The only thing left was the rope, hanging from the ceiling beam in the living room, swinging slightly as if someone had just stepped off the chair. But there was no body, no footprints, no sign of anyone at all. They say if you drive past that old house near the pines outside Bastrop, you can still see something hanging in the shadows of the porch. When the wind's just right, it moves, slow and deliberate, creaking like it remembers the weight it once held. Some say the wood beneath it is stained darker than the rest, no matter how much it rains. And if you ever touch it, your hand will come away wet, red, and warm, as if the rope's still alive. When Susan Whitaker first saw the old Remington typewriter sitting on the desk inside the antique shop on Alamo Street, she felt something stir inside her. It wasn't nostalgia exactly, though she had grown up around her grandfather's manual typewriter back in College Station. It was more like a quiet pull, a soft hum that seemed to come from the machine itself. The keys were dust-covered but unbroken, and when she pressed one out of idle curiosity, the hammers clacked with surprising smoothness. The old man who ran the shop looked up from his stool and said it had belonged to a school teacher who once lived on Old Mill Road in Brenham. He didn't say her name, and Susan didn't ask. She just bought it, $50 cash, and carried it home like she was rescuing something that had been waiting for her. Her small rental house on the outskirts of Brenham had been built in the 1940s, its wood floors creaking, its windows rattling faintly when the wind pushed through the pine trees. She set the typewriter on the small writing desk in her living room, beside a stack of old notebooks and a brass lamp. For years she'd promised herself she'd write again, but after her divorce and the move from Houston, she hadn't found the will to. That night, with a glass of wine and the distant sound of freight trains rolling through town, she sat down and touched the keys again. They felt colder than they had in the store, almost damp, as if they'd just been cleaned or handled by someone else. Still, she smiled, rolled in a blank sheet of paper, and began to type. The clacking sound filled the room like music. For a brief moment, it felt like life again. She wrote for hours. When she finally stood, her neck stiff, she glanced at the clock. 2:47 a.m. The paper in the typewriter was filled with uneven lines and ideas that barely made sense, but it didn't matter. For the first time in months, she had written something. She turned off the lamp, left the page half rolled in the carriage, and went to bed. At exactly 3:06 a.m., the sound started. The faint, deliberate click of a typewriter key being pressed, then another, then a pause, then another. In her half-sleeping haze, Susan thought maybe she'd left a window open and the wind had caught the paper. But the rhythm was too steady. A deliberate cadence, slow and purposeful, like someone forming words. The sound came from the living room. She sat up in bed and listened. It continued for almost a full minute, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The house went still again, leaving only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of pine branches outside. In the morning, she tried to laugh it off. When she walked into the living room, the paper in the typewriter was filled with a single repeated sentence. "I am still here." It had been typed over and over again, the letters slightly crooked, the ink faint in some places, darker in others. She stood frozen, reading the words again and again. She lived alone. The doors had been locked. There were no signs of entry, no footprints, no smudges on the floor. The windows were shut tight. She tore the page from the roller, crumpled it, and threw it in the trash. She unplugged the lamp, checked the doors again, and went to work in town, trying to ignore the image of those words burned into her mind. That night, she told herself it had been her mistake. Maybe she had typed it in a daze before going to bed. Maybe it was her subconscious trying to tell her something. She poured herself another glass of wine and sat on the couch, watching the minutes crawl past. At 3:06 a.m., the sound came again. The same slow, deliberate clicks. She froze, staring toward the dark living room. The lamp was off, but she could see the faint outline of the desk in the moonlight. The sound stopped. Then a final key clacked, sharp and singular. Silence followed. In the morning, there was a new sheet of paper in the carriage. Just one line, typed perfectly in the center. "Did you miss me?" She left the house that morning shaking. She took the typewriter and shoved it in the hall closet, slamming the door and turning the lock. For the next 3 nights, she slept with the radio on and her phone by her bed. Nothing happened. No sounds, no typing, no strange words. By the 4th night, she began to think she'd imagined it all. On the 5th, she forgot to check the closet door before bed. At 3:06 a.m., the typing began again. This time, it was faster, urgent, desperate. She jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and flipped on the hallway light. The noise stopped instantly. The closet door stood closed, but faint light glowed through the gap at the bottom, a sickly yellow shimmer like an old bulb burning behind it. She crept closer. The air felt thick and cold, like walking into a freezer. Her breath showed in the beam of the light. She reached for the doorknob, hesitated, then twisted it open. Inside, the typewriter sat on the floor, paper rolled halfway through, and its carriage was still slowly sliding back on its own, as if invisible fingers had just finished typing. She wanted to run, but something made her look down at the paper. The words were different this time. Not repeated, not angry. They were pleading. "Please let me finish." She stepped back, slammed the door, and didn't sleep again that night. In the following days, the atmosphere in the house changed. The lights flickered when she passed by. She began waking at 3:06 every night, even when there was no sound. The smell of dust and old paper filled the rooms. Sometimes, when she brushed her hand along the wall, her fingers came away streaked with faint black residue like typewriter ink. Her dreams turned vivid and strange. A woman in a long dress standing beside a desk, her face hidden behind a curtain of hair. Her hands gray and worn, fingertips blackened as if burned. Each morning, Susan found another page in the typewriter's tray, even though she hadn't gone near it. The words told a story, not fiction, a confession. The name at the bottom of one page stopped her cold. Margaret Crane, a schoolteacher who, according to a quick search online, had lived in Brenham during the 1950s and had gone missing without explanation. They found her house empty except for her typewriter and the manuscript she'd been working on. Rumor had it she'd been obsessed with writing the perfect ending. Some said she'd gone mad trying to finish her story. Others whispered she'd never left the house at all. The following week, Susan took the typewriter to the antique dealer who'd sold it to her. But when she arrived, the door was locked and the windows papered over. A sign read, "Closed permanently." No forwarding number, no explanation. She left the machine in her trunk and drove home, feeling the air grow heavier with every mile. That night, When she opened the trunk to carry the groceries in, the typewriter sat there with a new sheet already loaded. The keys were moving. Slowly, painfully, one letter at a time. The words formed as she watched. "You can help me end it." The next night, she moved the typewriter back into the house. Not because she wanted to, but because something in her felt it was necessary. She sat at the desk, turned on the lamp, and placed her hands on the keys. They were warm now. The paper was blank. She whispered, "What do you want me to write?" The carriage moved slightly, and then, as if guided by invisible force, the first sentence appeared. It told her about the night Margaret Crane died, about the story she'd written and the man who had come to her door claiming to be an admirer, about the argument, the struggle, the sound of a gunshot, the way her blood had splattered across the page. Her spirit trapped in the typewriter she'd loved, replaying the same sentence each night for decades, waiting for someone to read it to the end. The story filled 10 pages before Susan's hands began to ache. At 3:06 a.m., the typewriter stopped on its own. The last line read, "Thank you." Then the keys froze and the air in the house lightened as if a long-held breath had finally been released. She left the pages on the desk and went to bed with tears in her eyes, feeling something close to peace. In the morning, the pages were gone. Only the typewriter remained, clean, polished, and silent. For 3 nights after that, nothing happened. On the 4th, just after 3 a.m., Susan woke to the faint sound of typing again. She went to the living room, heart pounding, and found the typewriter alive once more. The paper rolled forward slowly, and when she leaned closer, she saw the words forming in fresh ink, letter by letter, steady and deliberate. They weren't Margaret's words this time. They were her own. A sentence she hadn't written yet. A sentence describing her sitting at the desk, watching the keys move, and the last line typed itself as she reached for the power cord. It said, "She's finally part of the story now." They first noticed the crosses when the rains came early that spring. The ground south of Marfa, out by the old windmill past Highway 90, was soft and dark for the first time in years, and the water ran off in long, thin rivulets that carried bits of wood and stone into the open. A rancher named Ellis Warren was fixing a sagging fence when he saw them, small wooden sticks poking up from the dirt in neat little rows. They weren't big, maybe 6 or 7 inches tall, carved roughly like someone had whittled them from scrap wood. He might not have thought much of it if not for the way each one was buried upside down. The arms of the cross pressed into the ground, leaving only the narrow base pointing skyward, and each one had a set of initials burned into the wood. Not carved, burned. Black and uneven, but deliberate. There were about 40 of them that first day, laid out in a pattern he couldn't make sense of. Ellis called his neighbor Cal to come take a look. Cal was older, a quiet type who still remembered when the town was smaller and the nights darker. He squatted in the mud beside the crosses and touched one of them lightly with his finger. "Ain't no one from town with these initials," he said, reading one that looked like MWF. "Maybe kids playing some kind of trick?" Ellis didn't answer. There was something about the crosses that didn't feel like a prank. They were too careful, too uniform, and they weren't weathered the way they should have been if they'd been there long. It looked like they'd been buried just hours before the rain started. By the next morning, the crosses had doubled. The pattern stretched further toward the windmill now, spreading like a rash. Ellis called the sheriff, who came out with a deputy and stood staring for a long time. Sheriff Donnelly didn't like mysteries. "You sure you didn't put these here?" he asked, half joking. Ellis didn't laugh. They dug a few of the crosses out, flipped them right side up, but underneath there was nothing, just mud. No bones, no stones, no signs of digging other than where the crosses had been stuck in. The sheriff told them to leave them be for now and said he'd look into the initials, maybe run them against some missing person records just to ease his own curiosity. That night, the wind started howling across the plains, and Ellis's cattle wouldn't stop bawling. He went out with a flashlight around midnight and saw the herd pressed tight against the northern fence, refusing to go anywhere near the field with the crosses. He stood there, shining the light across the ground, and he swore he saw the tops of the crosses trembling, though the wind wasn't touching them directly. The soil around them looked like it was breathing, rising and falling ever so slightly as if something underneath was shifting. He backed away slowly, telling himself it was just the wet earth settling. The next day, he drove into Marfa to talk to the sheriff again. Donnelly told him the initials didn't match anyone local or missing. He said it like he was relieved, though his face didn't show it. When Ellis got home, there were new crosses, hundreds of them stretching nearly to the road. They weren't just in neat rows anymore. They were curving into some kind of spiral, twisting inward like a funnel. He thought about burning them, but the idea made him sick, like his body itself recoiled at the thought. That night he didn't sleep. The sound outside wasn't just the wind anymore. It was whispering. Not words exactly. More like the faint suggestion of speech, the sound of something trying to remember how to talk. Around 3 a.m, the power flickered, and his porch light glowed red for a second before dying. When he looked out the window, he saw faint movement among the crosses, as though pale shapes were kneeling between them, rising and falling in rhythm with the wind. He stayed frozen until dawn. By the end of the week, the crosses had reached the fence line. The deputy came back out to take pictures, but his camera wouldn't work right. Every photo came out blurry, like fog had rolled across the lens. Ellis's dog, Scout, ran off one night and didn't come back. When he finally found him 2 days later, the animal was sitting perfectly still among the crosses, not barking or whining, just staring at the ground. When Ellis tried to pick him up, the dog's fur was wet, though there hadn't been rain. The smell on him was like old wood and something sour, like turned milk. That night, Scout died without making a sound. The sheriff decided to have a few of the crosses taken into town for examination. He sent 2 men out to dig them up. They managed to pull 3 before something in the earth gave way beneath them. The ground just collapsed like a sinkhole wide and deep, swallowing one of the men waist-deep in mud. When they got him out, he was trembling, mumbling about feeling something move below him. The wood from the crosses they took cracked and split in the back of the patrol truck before they reached town, like it couldn't stand being carried away from the others. Inside each one was a core of something dark, something that looked too much like dried flesh. The sheriff didn't mention that part in his report. 2 nights later, the lights in Marfa flickered across the whole town. People said they saw strange orbs floating out near the desert, brighter and lower than the usual Marfa lights. A few said they saw shapes walking between them, tall, thin figures that moved in jerks like marionettes with tangled strings. Ellis saw them too from his porch, though he wished he hadn't. Every time the light flashed, it showed the crosses rearranging themselves, shifting closer, as if the earth itself was helping them crawl. When morning came, they were within 20 feet of his house. He packed his truck and left, or at least he tried. The tires spun in the soft dirt, and when he got out to check, the ground behind the truck was littered with new crosses, smaller ones, maybe the size of a finger. Each bore his initials, EW, burned neatly into the surface. He left the truck and ran on foot toward town, stumbling through the brush until he reached the road. He never went back to his ranch after that. The sheriff took a crew out there 2 days later, but the field was empty. Every single cross was gone, the ground smooth as if nothing had ever been planted there. They found Ellis's truck still in the yard, but it was filled with water, clear and cold despite the heat. Floating inside were a few small wooden slivers no bigger than matchsticks, each carved with initials no one recognized. The sheriff retired not long after, and no one bought the ranch again. The land sits quiet now, though sometimes travelers on Highway 90 say they see things out by the windmill at night, tiny glints of reflected light, as if something polished is catching the moon. And when the storms come through in spring, the soil loosens again, and people swear they can smell wet wood and burnt rope in the air. If you walk close enough, you can still hear the faint whisper of the wind moving through the grass, almost like names being spoken softly, one after another, none of them belonging to anyone you've ever known. When Maggie found the little toy truck, she almost didn't pick it up. It was lying in the overgrown grass near the curb outside her duplex in South Austin, half buried and caked in mud, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a forgotten sandbox. She nudged it with the toe of her shoe and noticed the tiny metal wheels still turned, though stiff with rust. The body was made of faded red tin, the kind that used to cut kids' fingers back in the 60s, and someone had once painted a crude white number 7 on the side. She brushed it off with her sleeve, and it gave a faint metallic rattle when she shook it. A marble or pebble was trapped inside. It was oddly heavy, heavier than a toy that size should be. She took it inside that evening, setting it on the kitchen counter while she unpacked groceries. It looked harmless enough, quaint even, like something her father might have played with when he was a kid. When she turned off the lights to go to bed, she glanced at it again and almost smiled at how it caught the dull orange glow of the street lamp outside. It made her feel less alone somehow, as if the house, quiet and too big since the divorce, had something small and harmless living in it again. The first night, the noise woke her at 2:14 a.m. It wasn't loud, just a soft clack against the tile floor. She thought at first it was the refrigerator cycling or the ice maker dropping a cube, but then she heard it again. A roll, a brief stop, then another roll. She turned on the lamp and sat up, listening. The sound came from the front of the house, faint but deliberate. The kind of movement you notice only because it repeats when you expect silence. She got up and crept into the hallway, her bare feet cold on the wood. The house was still except for that tiny sound. It was coming from near the door. She reached for the light switch, and when the overhead light flicked on, she saw it. The little red truck resting neatly against the base of the front door. She frowned, confused but not frightened yet. Maybe she'd left it near the edge of the counter, and vibration from traffic or the AC vent had nudged it off. She picked it up, turned it over in her hand, and saw a small smear of fresh mud along one wheel. She didn't remember there being any left when she'd cleaned it. She wiped it off and put it back on the counter, this time farther from the edge. She told herself it was nothing, that she was tired, that her mind was still too jumpy in the new place. The second night it happened again, almost to the minute. She'd made sure this time to place the toy in the middle of the counter. But when the soft rolling sound came, it didn't come from above her head or the kitchen. It came from the hall, the same slow, deliberate path ending at the front door. She didn't turn on the light this time. She stood there in the dark, listening as it stopped moving, the final wheel click echoing slightly against the hardwood. Her stomach twisted, and she waited several minutes before she dared to step forward. When she did, she found it sitting there once more, the red tin faintly gleaming under the moonlight filtering through the blinds. She picked it up and felt the same strange heaviness, the same faint rattle inside. The next morning, she tried to reason it out. Maybe the air conditioner vent had enough force to push it. Maybe the floor was slightly tilted. Maybe her mind was simply looking for patterns because the house was quiet and empty. She'd moved there after her divorce from Ryan, a quiet programmer who'd moved to Dallas with someone younger. The silence in her new home was still new, and she was trying to fill it with noise, even odd noise. That afternoon, she noticed something different. Where the truck had rested by the door, there was a faint, wet outline on the floor. A little muddy streak that led nowhere, as if someone with tiny hands had picked it up and left without walking away. She cleaned it up and didn't mention it when she spoke to her sister on the phone later. By the fourth night, she began locking the toy in a drawer. She felt ridiculous doing it, but she couldn't stand the sound anymore. The soft roll and stop, the metallic tick of wheels turning. She even set her phone to record the sound overnight. But in the morning, the recording was blank. Nothing but the soft hum of air conditioning. Still, when she opened the drawer, the toy wasn't there. She found it waiting again by the door. Maggie stopped sleeping well after that. Every sound in the house made her twitch. She tried moving the toy outside, setting it on the porch railing. When she woke up the next morning, it was sitting on the welcome mat. A bit of damp earth clung to its side, and this time the white number 7 seemed darker, like the paint had been refreshed in the night. She called her neighbor, an older man named Everett who'd lived in the duplex next door for nearly 30 years. He came over to take a look, amused at first until she showed him the faint streaks on the floorboards and the growing mud stains she kept finding by the door. Everett rubbed his chin and said he remembered a family who'd lived there long before Maggie moved in. A woman, her husband, and their little boy. The boy had been about 6 or 7 when he disappeared back in 1973 or so. The story had gone quiet after that. They never found him, Everett said. Used to see his mama out on the porch for years after, just sitting there like she expected him to come back up the road. Maggie's throat went dry. She asked what the boy's name was, but Everett couldn't remember for sure. Started with a J, I think. Jason maybe, or Jeremy. Used to drive one of them old red Tonka trucks everywhere he went. That night, Maggie didn't sleep at all. She left every light on in the house and sat on the couch watching the front door. At 2:14 a.m., she heard it again, the faint rattle, the creak of a wheel turning. The toy rolled slowly across the floor from the kitchen, moving on its own, wobbling slightly as if guided by unseen fingers. It stopped at the door and rested there, the same as before. She whispered to the empty room, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" For a long time, nothing happened. Then came the sound of something light tapping against the wood. Like a small hand knocking once politely, Maggie backed away until she hit the wall. Her breath came short, her heart hammering. The toy didn't move again, but she could hear something faint beyond the door, a slow dragging on the porch boards. She almost opened it. She almost turned the handle, but fear held her frozen until dawn came and light broke through the blinds. The next morning, she called a realtor. She wanted out. She didn't care if she lost her deposit. She didn't even finish packing that day. By the afternoon, she'd moved everything she could fit into her car, leaving only a few things behind. The couch, a lamp, a box of dishes. She told herself she'd come back for them later. When she returned that evening just to grab the last few boxes, the front door was standing wide open. The toy truck sat in the middle of the living room. Beside it was a small wet footprint no bigger than a child's. She didn't go inside. She turned around, got in her car, and drove away, leaving the door open to whatever waited there. A week later, the duplex went back on the market. A young couple bought it within days. The husband posted a cheerful photo online, showing off the freshly painted porch. In the corner of the picture, nearly hidden by a potted plant, sat a little red truck. The caption read, "Found this outside. Must have been left by the previous owner. Cute little thing. Rolls by itself when the floor creaks, like it's trying to go home." When the rain came down that April morning, it hit the cracked cement in front of the old farmhouse like coins on a gravestone. Sharp and steady. The house sat 3 miles outside Bandera, past the last gas station and down a winding stretch of county road where the oak trees leaned close enough to scratch your windows. It had been abandoned for years, or at least that's what most folks said. But when Tom and Claire Kersey bought the property at an auction, the papers said nothing about why the previous owners had walked away. Only that they had stopped making payments in 1992 and left everything behind. The cement porch was the first thing Tom wanted to fix. He said it was cracked bad enough to trip over, and he couldn't stand seeing weeds sprouting through it. When he rented a jackhammer from the hardware store in town, the man behind the counter gave him a look that stuck with him all the way home. Bandera folks could be like that. Silent, polite, but with that undercurrent of, you don't know what you're buying into. By the second afternoon, Tom had broken through most of the top layer. Claire was on the porch sipping from a sweating glass of sweet tea when he called her over. There was something solid underneath the cement, but it wasn't dirt or gravel. It looked like glass, grimy and gray beneath a thin layer of mud. When he brushed it with his gloves, he realized it was a mirror, rectangular, about 3 feet wide, framed in rusted metal. The mirror hadn't cracked, not even with the jackhammer pounding above it. Claire crouched beside it, curious but uneasy. They pulled at the edges until they freed it, the cement around it flaking away like old scabs. When they lifted it out, it was cold. Colder than anything that had been buried in Texas soil had a right to be. Tom leaned it against the porch railing and stepped back, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. That was when they noticed it. The reflection didn't show the porch or the oak trees or the gray Bandera sky. It showed a room, a basement by the look of it. Dirt floor, low ceiling, wooden beams slick with moisture. There was light in there, but it wasn't sunlight. It was faint, like the yellow glow of a single bulb hanging from a wire. Claire blinked, stepped closer, and for a moment she thought she saw movement. Something like a person standing just beyond the edge of the reflection, unmoving, pale against the dim background. When she turned around, there was nothing behind her but the yard. Tom thought it was some kind of trick of light. He turned the mirror around, but its back was just solid rusted metal, the kind of industrial panel you'd see on an old furnace. When he set it back down, the image didn't change. The same basement, same wooden beams, same faint light. That night, neither of them could sleep. They argued about whether to keep the thing or call someone. Maybe an appraiser, maybe the sheriff. Tom laughed it off and said maybe they'd found some kind of art piece buried there by the old owners. But around midnight, Claire woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps followed by a soft dragging noise. She nudged Tom awake and he went to the window. The porch was empty. When he stepped outside with a flashlight, the mirror was no longer leaning against the railing. It was lying flat face up right where they'd dug it out. The reflection was still there, that same dim basement. Only now it looked closer, like the floorboards above had vanished entirely. Over the next few days, strange things started happening in the house. The floor in the hallway creaked even when no one walked there. The dog refused to go near the porch. Tom's phone would die every time he tried to take a picture of the mirror. And Claire swore she heard whispering through the vents at night, voices murmuring too low to understand. On the fourth day, Tom went back to town to rent a truck. He said he was going to haul the mirror off to the dump near Medina. When he didn't come back by sunset, Claire called his phone, but there was no signal. She walked outside, calling his name, but all she found was the mirror, upright again against the railing, spotless now as if freshly cleaned. And this time the basement was brighter. There was more visible inside. A wooden chair, a workbench, and what looked like a set of stairs leading up toward where the viewer would be standing. Claire dropped her tea glass and it shattered across the porch. In the reflection, the figure she'd thought she'd imagined before was now clearly visible. A man wearing Tom's shirt standing halfway down the stairs, staring upward. When the sheriff came the next morning, Claire was sitting on the steps, soaked to the bone, though the sky was dry. She couldn't stop staring at the mirror. The deputies found Tom's truck on the side of FM 470, engine off, driver's door open, no sign of him. They assumed he'd wandered into the woods, maybe disoriented. They searched for 3 days and found nothing. After that, Claire moved back to San Antonio, leaving the house empty again. The mirror stayed where it was. Sometimes neighbors driving by said they saw someone sitting on the porch even though the place was boarded up. The reflection always showed a light underground, flickering faintly like something waiting to climb out. In July, the property went up for auction again. The listing described it as a fixer-upper with potential. No mention of the mirror, no mention of the missing man. But the first person who came to view it, a young couple from Kerrville, took one look at the porch and decided to keep driving. They said it felt like the house was breathing, like something beneath it was waiting for the cement to crack again. And late at night, if you drive down that stretch of Bandera Road and flash your headlights toward the porch, you might catch a glimpse of it. An old mirror standing by itself, gleaming faintly in the dark. Only it won't be showing your reflection. It'll be showing the basement just as it always has. A single hanging bulb, a dirt floor, and a man standing still in the light, staring upward at the world that buried him. Under the low orange haze of evening, the small town of Lockhart seemed quieter than usual, the streets heavy with heat and the faint smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. The air shimmered against the blacktop of Main Street, and beyond the courthouse square, the old Miller house sat half hidden behind overgrown pecan trees, its porch sagging like a tired face. It was there that Andrew Price first found the key. He'd bought the house for next to nothing, a foreclosure that no one else in town wanted. Locals told him it had been empty since the early 90s, and even before that. People said strange things happened around it, lights flickering in the attic, the sound of footsteps on the porch when no one was there. He laughed it off, told himself people in small towns invented stories to make their boredom feel like folklore. But the first night he spent there, he noticed how the walls seemed to breathe, how the silence pressed against him like it was listening. He was cleaning out the crawl space 2 weeks later when he found the key. It was wedged between 2 floorboards, deep in the dust and cobwebs, wrapped in a yellowed piece of cloth. The metal was almost black with rust, thick and heavy, shaped in a way he hadn't seen before. The teeth were long, jagged, uneven, and the bow had strange symbols etched into it, swirls and crosses that seemed hand-carved. When he unwrapped it, he half expected it to fall apart, but it didn't. It felt solid, cold even in the summer heat, as though it had never warmed in its entire existence. At first, he thought it might fit one of the doors in the house. The place had 6 of them inside, not counting the closets. 2 on the main floor, 4 upstairs, but the key didn't fit a single one. Not the front, not the back, not even the old padlock on the shed. Yet every time he held it, a strange sense of importance filled him, like it wasn't just an object, but a thing that was waiting to be used. He put it on his nightstand that evening, but he woke up at 3:30 in the morning to the faint sound of metal scraping wood. When he turned on the lamp, the key was gone. He found it the next morning lying in the hallway near the front door, as if someone had set it there carefully. He tried to ignore it, but the next few nights were worse. The same time, always between 3 and 4, the same sound, like a key turning in an unseen lock followed by a low creak somewhere in the walls. One night he heard whispering, not voices exactly, but the dry movement of air shaped into something that resembled words. He finally asked the owner of the hardware store about it, an older man named Clyde who'd lived in Lockhart all his life. When Andrew showed him the key, the man's expression changed. He held it gingerly like it might burn him. "You found this where?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. When Andrew told him, Clyde stared for a moment, then set the key back on the counter. "I've seen one like it," he said. "Long time ago. Out near County Road 214, there's an old church, St. Bridget's. Been abandoned since before my daddy was born. They said there was a door in the basement. One that didn't belong there. One they built the whole church around." Andrew laughed nervously, thinking it was another local ghost story, but the old man didn't smile. "That key's not meant to open anything in a house," he said. "If you're smart, you'll leave it where you found it." That night, Andrew dreamt of a church he'd never seen. Its white paint was peeling, its windows blacked out. He walked toward it through knee-high grass, holding the key in his hand. The closer he got, the louder something banged inside, like fists on wood. He woke drenched in sweat, the key lying on his chest. The next morning, despite everything telling him not to, he got in his truck and drove. He followed County Road 214 until the pavement turned to dirt and the mesquite trees grew thick around the road. The church wasn't hard to find. It stood alone in a clearing, its steeple collapsed, its roof caved in on one side. A wooden sign, barely legible, still read, "St. Bridget's Catholic Church." The place smelled of rot and wet stone. When he stepped inside, the air changed. It felt heavier, cooler, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. Dust motes floated through shafts of light leaking from broken windows. The pews were warped, the altar overturned, but it was the door in the back that caught his attention. It was half hidden behind the remains of the pulpit, its wood darker than the rest, its handle crusted with rust. The moment he saw it, he knew. The key belonged there. He hesitated, the silence pressing against his eardrums. Then slowly he slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. The teeth slid in without resistance, as if it had been waiting for that moment. When he turned it, the sound that came out of the mechanism was not metallic. It was almost organic, like a deep exhale from something buried. The air in the church trembled. The door creaked open an inch, then stopped. Beyond it, darkness. Not the kind you see in a basement or an unlit room, but a kind that seemed to absorb the light around it, like the absence of anything at all. He pushed it open farther, his hand trembling. The steps led downward into blackness. A cold wind drifted up, carrying the faint smell of earth and iron. He shone his flashlight down, but it only reached so far before the beam vanished completely, swallowed whole. For a moment he thought he heard movement, a scuffling sound, distant and slow. Then something whispered his name. He stumbled back, his heart pounding, the flashlight flickering. He should have run, should have locked the door and left it there, but something pulled at him. Not physically, but deeper, a compulsion that made his chest tighten. He stepped down the first stair, then another. The temperature dropped so quickly that his breath fogged. The sound grew clearer, breathing, slow and heavy, somewhere below. The walls around him were slick with moisture, and the steps were carved from stone, spiraling deeper than they should have. He lost count after 50 steps. When he finally reached the bottom, his light caught something impossible. A corridor stretched ahead, lined with doors. Not church doors, not wood or metal, but flesh-colored. Their surfaces pulsed faintly like skin. The air reeked of decay. He stepped closer and saw shapes pressed into each one. Faces, their mouths open as if screaming silently. His flashlight flickered again, and for a brief second he thought he saw their eyes move. A sound came from behind him, soft but unmistakable, the key turning in a lock. He spun around, but the staircase was gone. The air grew thicker, vibrating like the inside of a drum. The whispers started again, rising in a dozen overlapping tones. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The doors began to open one by one, their edges splitting with a wet sound. From inside came shapes that didn't belong to any world he knew. Long, twisted limbs, pale skin stretched thin, eyes that glowed faintly like dying embers. They moved without sound, crawling toward him with a strange grace. The key in his hand burned hot, the metal searing into his skin. In that moment, he understood what it had unlocked. It wasn't a door to a basement. It was a threshold. Something had been sealed there long ago. Something meant to be forgotten. He screamed, the sound lost in the roar of voices that erupted from every wall. The air collapsed inward and the world folded. When the sheriff found his truck 3 days later, it was parked outside the church. Door open, engine dead. Inside the church, everything was silent. No footprints, no sign of struggle. The only thing they found was the key, lying on the altar, cleaned of rust and gleaming as if newly forged. The church door at the back was locked tight again, and no one in town ever managed to open it. They said the lock had fused shut, like the metal had melted into itself. Years passed and the story faded into another Lockhart rumor. But on some nights when the wind shifts and the air grows cold, those who live near the old church say they hear something moving under the ground. They say the earth breathes. And sometimes, if you're close enough, you can hear the faint click of a key turning deep below the dirt, unlocking something that should have stayed closed forever. When the drought hit San Angelo, the Concho River looked more like a long, cracked scar running through the heart of town. The sun beat down hard enough to bleach the old rocks white, and the air smelled faintly of dust and metal. People stopped fishing, stopped walking their dogs by the banks, and just waited for the rain that never came. It was late September when the city finally sent crews out to dredge what was left of the riverbed, hoping to clear debris before the fall rains hit again. That's when they found the bones. At first, the workers thought it was an animal skeleton, maybe a deer or coyote, but when one of them picked up a rib and brushed it clean, he saw letters carved deep into the bone. Old, neat lettering that spelled out a name. Not initials, not symbols, an entire name in tidy capital letters. The discovery made the local news, but they kept the details vague. Only the workers and the police knew what was written. They stopped the dredging and fenced off the area, but a few days later more bones turned up further downstream. Smaller this time, fragile and thin like a child's. The letters were still there, carved in the same careful hand. The sheriff tried to calm the town by saying it was probably some old ritual or prank, but even he didn't sound convinced. San Angelo was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened, until something like that broke through. I wasn't supposed to get involved. I was a substitute teacher at Lone Star Elementary, picking up classes wherever I could. But one of my students, a quiet boy named Miles, stopped showing up that week. He'd been the kind of kid who always sat in the back sketching on lined paper. When I checked his last drawings before they cleaned out his desk, I froze. He had drawn bones, thin, delicate bones lined up on a riverbank, each one etched with letters. The name he'd written across them was his own. I drove out to the Concho that evening, past the fence they'd put up, past the signs that said city property. The riverbed was a flat, dusty graveyard of rocks and weeds. You could see where the mud had cracked open like broken glass. I walked until I found the area where they'd done the dredging, and I swear I felt something change in the air, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. It smelled faintly of wet earth, even though the ground was bone dry. That's when I saw the first one. It was half buried near a tree stump, small enough to fit in my hand. I brushed away the dirt and found what looked like a carved tibia, smooth and pale, with the letters L-A-N-E scratched neatly across it. The bone didn't look ancient. It was clean, fresh. I dropped it and took a step back, but something caught my eye. Just beyond it, more bones were sticking out of the ground in a strange formation, laid out in the shape of a small skeleton, but incomplete. Someone had arranged them deliberately, spelling names on each individual bone. There was movement behind me, soft and wet like someone walking barefoot through mud. I turned, but there was no one there, only the rustle of wind through the brittle grass. I picked up one of the smaller bones again, and for a second I thought I heard something under the surface. A faint tapping, like something knocking from below. I left that place fast, drove home with the windows down to clear the air, but the smell of damp earth followed me all the way. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the knocking, faint but rhythmic somewhere in the walls. Around 2 a.m. I got up to get a drink, and when I walked past my kitchen window, I saw movement outside. A figure stood by my mailbox, motionless. I flicked on the porch light and the shape vanished. When I stepped outside, the only thing there was a small bone lying on my porch step. It had my last name carved into it. I didn't go to the police. Who would believe me? They'd think I'd stolen one from the site or made it up. Instead, I went to Miles's house the next morning. His mother opened the door looking hollow, her eyes red from crying. She told me he'd disappeared 2 nights before, right around the time I'd been down at the river. The police were searching, but they hadn't found a thing. I almost told her about the bones, but stopped myself. The next few days blurred together. The knocking didn't stop, it just changed locations. Sometimes in the walls, sometimes beneath the floor. One night I woke to the sound of it coming from under my bed, steady as a heartbeat. I leaned over and whispered, "Who's there?" And it stopped, Then from the darkness came a faint voice, a child's voice. It said my name. I ripped up the floorboards the next morning, desperate to find something tangible, anything to make sense of what was happening. The wood came up easily and the smell hit me immediately, wet soil just like the riverbed. Beneath the boards was a shallow cavity filled with loose dirt, and right in the center lay a single bone smaller than the rest. It was a phalanx, I think, a finger bone. The letters carved into it spelled miles. I took it outside and threw it as far as I could into the field behind my house, then went back inside shaking. That night the voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was crying. I could hear it clearly, coming from the direction of the field. I tried to ignore it, but the crying grew louder, angrier, until it sounded like it was right outside my window. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out. The beam caught a shape crouched near the edge of the grass. A child, filthy and pale, with mud smeared across his face. Miles. He was holding something in his hands, a handful of bones. I called his name, but he didn't respond. He just stared at me with eyes that looked too dark, too hollow. When I took a step closer, he whispered something I'll never forget. He wants them back. Then he scattered the bones across the ground and vanished. I fell to my knees and picked up one. It was warm, freshly carved with a new name etched into it. Mine. The sheriff found me out there the next morning, half conscious, covered in dirt. He said I was lucky someone saw my car lights and called it in. I didn't tell him about Miles or the voice or the bone with my name. I didn't have to, because when they searched the area, they found a shallow pit behind my house. Inside were dozens of bones, small and precise, arranged in the shape of a child. Each bone bore a name. Not all of them local. Some from towns miles away. They sealed the site again and told the press nothing. I left San Angelo that week and never went back. But sometimes when I pass a river or see cracked earth under the sun, I catch the faint smell of damp soil. And every so often I'll find something small on my doorstep wrapped in mud and silence. A bone carved clean and white, spelling out a name I don't yet recognize. But deep down, I think I know who it belongs to. Because there's one more name that hasn't been carved yet. And he's still waiting. Under the coastal sun of Corpus Christi, the wind always carried the salt smell of the bay, mixed with the dry tang of heat and dust. Out on the northern edge of town, where the subdivisions were just starting to push into the scrubland, there was a vacant lot that had sat untouched for years. Developers had marked it for new homes, but something had stalled the project. A rumor maybe about bad soil or some old ownership dispute. No one really cared. It was just another patch of Texas dirt, overgrown with weeds, the kind of place neighborhood kids cut through when walking home from school. Until the day Mark Davison's crew brought in the backhoe. Mark had been running Davison Construction for a decade, and he knew the ground around Corpus like the back of his hand. Hard-packed clay, limestone veins, the occasional patch of sand. He wasn't a superstitious man, but he'd grown up in small towns long enough to know you didn't dig up old land without respecting what might be under it. Old wells, broken septic tanks, unmarked graves. He'd seen it all. But that morning in late September, when his foreman yelled for him to come take a look at something strange, Mark thought it was just another headache, another delay. At first he thought they'd found toys. The sun caught on something in the dirt, and he crouched down to see a tiny black shoe, scuffed at the toe and still faintly shiny like patent leather. It looked brand new. He brushed the soil away with a gloved hand and froze. There was another next to it, a perfect pair sitting side by side just an inch below the surface. He frowned and called for a shovel, expecting maybe a box or an old trunk. But as they cleared the earth, more appeared. Pairs of shoes, children's sizes, lined up neatly in rows. Some leather, some canvas, some with little bows or Velcro straps, each one placed with unsettling precision. And when Mark picked one up, his stomach turned. The shoe was warm. He turned it over in his hand, felt the heat through the sole. Not the kind of warmth you'd get from sitting in the sun. These had been buried. He looked at his crew, saw the unease on their faces. One of them, an older man named Julio, crossed himself and muttered something in Spanish. "They're fresh," Julio said. "They shouldn't be warm." The others laughed nervously, but no one wanted to keep digging. Mark told them to stop for the day. He'd call the sheriff. Probably some sick prank, he thought. Some local kids, maybe. But deep down, he knew no kid would go to the trouble of lining up dozens of pairs like that. All different styles, all clean. When the sheriff arrived, the air was heavy and still, the kind of humid pressure that settles over the Gulf before a storm. He was a heavy-set man named Crowley, with gray sideburns and a way of making every sentence sound like a challenge. He knelt by the trench, touching the edge of one shoe with his pen. "You say you found them like this?" he asked. Mark nodded. Crowley exhaled sharply through his nose. "Looks like a damn art project," he said. "You try pulling any up?" Mark hesitated. "Just the one," he said. "It was warm." Crowley gave him a skeptical look. "Warm," he repeated. He signaled to one of his deputies, a kid barely out of academy, to bag one pair for evidence. The deputy picked up a small pair of red sneakers and dropped them into a plastic bag. Then he flinched. "Jesus, they are warm," he said. Crowley gave him a glare, but when he reached out himself, his hand paused halfway, like they just came off a kid's feet, the deputy whispered. Crowley said nothing. By nightfall, the site was taped off. Word spread through the town fast, and by morning, reporters were parked along the chain-link fence. The developers pulled out of the deal within the week. The sheriff's office released no statement, but Mark knew something was wrong when the trench stayed open, guarded day and night, and the local paper quietly stopped asking questions. The rest of his crew refused to go back. Julio told him flatly he wouldn't set foot on that ground again. "There's something there," he said. "Something watching." Mark tried to move on. He took a few smaller jobs inland, roof repairs, deck builds, but at night he couldn't sleep. He'd see the shoes in his head, lined up perfectly, toes pointing west. He could still feel the heat of that patent leather in his palm. It didn't make sense. One night, driven by something he couldn't name, he drove out there alone. The lot was dark, the chain-link fence still standing, the sheriff's tape fluttering in the wind. There was no guard now, just silence and the hum of distant highway lights. He parked by the ditch and climbed over. The ground was uneven, the grass tall. He found the trench easily. It hadn't been filled. The moonlight caught on something below. He knelt, heart thudding, and brushed the dirt away. The shoes were still there, but they were not like he remembered. The leather was dull now, the colors faded, and as he reached for one, a smell hit him, sweet and rotting like damp earth and old meat. He stumbled back. The shoe twitched. He froze, staring. It wasn't the shoe. It was the soil beneath it, shifting slightly, as if something underneath had exhaled. He stood quickly, backing away. The rows of shoes seemed to stretch farther than before, disappearing into the dark. Then he heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound like the patter of small feet on hard ground, faint and fast, coming from the far end of the lot. He turned his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam caught only dust. The footsteps stopped. Then a whisper, so quiet he thought it was the wind. It came again, closer, breathy and childlike. "They're not yours." His mouth went dry. He swung the light wildly, catching only flashes of pale dirt, fragments of worn soles. Then silence. He left, stumbling over the fence, scraping his arm, tearing his shirt. He didn't stop driving until he hit the bridge over the bay. The next morning, he went to the sheriff's office. Crowley wasn't there. A deputy said he'd taken leave. Family emergency. Mark asked where the evidence was, the shoes, the report. The deputy looked confused. "What report?" he said. "We never got anything from that site. Just some empty ground. You sure you got the right place?" Mark left before he said something he'd regret. Over the next week, he tried to convince himself he'd imagined it. The heat, the smell, the whisper. It could all be exhaustion, stress, something he'd built up in his head. But every night he'd hear it again. A faint scuffing sound under his bedroom floor, like someone walking barefoot, slow and deliberate. He'd rip up the boards, find nothing but dust. Then he'd check the closet, the crawl space. Always empty. But every morning there'd be a footprint somewhere on the floor. Small, faint, bare. The last time anyone saw Mark was 2 weeks later. His truck was found idling near the same lot. Driver's door open, lights on. His tools were in the back, untouched. They searched the property, the trenches, everything. No trace of him. But when they looked under the soil again, there were more shoes than before. Each pair perfectly lined, toes pointing west. Among them, one pair was larger, mud-caked work boots still warm to the touch. When Matt and Lacey Hargrove moved into the new house on the edge of Abilene, it felt like they'd finally reached the quiet chapter of life they'd both been chasing. The house was built on a stretch of open land just outside city limits. A modest modern place with wide windows and a long gravel drive that crunched like snow under tires. It had been part of a new development called Sand Creek Estates, rows of identical beige homes where the prairie met the horizon. They bought theirs at a discount because, according to the realtor, the previous buyer backed out at the last second. It didn't bother them. They had 2 kids, a dog, and a dream of starting over somewhere still enough to hear the wind. On the day they moved in, Matt found the VHS tape. It wasn't hidden, not exactly. It was just there, sitting on a low wooden shelf in the unfinished basement. The label was handwritten in blue ink that had faded to green. Play me. There wasn't anything else on it. No brand, no stickers, just those 2 words. Lacey assumed it had been left behind by the builders or one of the inspectors, but something about the handwriting caught Matt's attention. It looked oddly deliberate, with clean strokes, no smudges. They didn't even own a VHS player, so the tape went into a drawer and stayed there for a week. But one night after the kids had gone to bed, curiosity got the better of him. He found an old player on Facebook Marketplace, picked it up from a guy in town and set it up in the living room. Lacey laughed at him for going to the trouble. "If it's a porn tape, I'm going to kill you," she said jokingly. When he pressed play, the screen filled with static. For a few seconds, nothing but white noise hissed through the speakers. Then the image flickered into view. A dimly lit living room. It wasn't theirs, but it was close. The same window placement, the same archway leading into the kitchen, the same beam across the ceiling. Only the decor looked like something out of the late 1990s. Box TV, floral couch, patterned carpet. The camera was still, as if resting on a tripod or table. No one was in frame at first. Just that quiet, empty room, colors slightly warped by age and magnetic tape. Then a figure walked in. A man in jeans and a white undershirt. He didn't look at the camera. He moved slowly, like someone lost in thought. He sat down on the couch, leaned forward, and rested his head in his hands. After nearly a minute, he spoke, his voice low and shaky. "If you're seeing this," he said, "then it worked." Lacey frowned. "What does he mean, it worked?" The man went on, speaking haltingly. "The land was clean. It was supposed to be clean. They said there was nothing left here. But it's still under there, and it doesn't stop." He lifted his head, staring straight into the lens now, eyes wide. "Don't build here. Please don't build here." Then he stood, turned toward the hallway, and said something too quiet to catch. The screen rippled with static, then jumped to another scene. Same house, but darker now. The lights were off except for a lamp by the window. The camera was closer to the floor. The man was gone, replaced by someone else. A woman standing at the kitchen sink, shoulders trembling. A long, low hum began under the audio, a bass-like vibration that seemed to rattle through the speakers. The woman turned, her face pale and wet with tears. "It's not me," she said hoarsely. "It's not me doing it." Lacey reached for the remote, but Matt stopped her. "Wait," he said. The hum grew louder. The woman backed away from the sink, glancing toward the hallway. Then faintly, another sound emerged beneath the hum, a rhythmic thumping like footsteps on hollow wood. The woman covered her ears and screamed, though her voice was muffled by distortion. The camera tilted suddenly as if knocked over, and the frame went sideways. For a brief second before the tape cut to black, the image caught something behind her. It looked like a doorway, but there wasn't supposed to be one there. Matt ejected the tape, his heart hammering. "That's not our layout," he said, though he knew it was close. "This was filmed in a house just like ours." Lacey shook her head. "No, that's impossible. These houses didn't exist 20 years ago." The next day he called the realtor, asking if any other houses had been built on the land before. She sounded confused. "That subdivision is brand new," she said. "That lot was open prairie for decades. Why do you ask?" He didn't mention the tape. That night as they lay in bed, he heard the same low hum from the video. It was faint at first, almost like a generator somewhere in the distance. Then it grew stronger, vibrating through the floorboards. He got up, checked every room, and found nothing. The hum stopped when he reached the basement door. He stood there for a long time, hand on the knob, listening. Then he turned on the light and went down. The basement smelled like earth and sawdust. There was no machinery, no pipes rattling. Just the concrete floor and that wooden shelf where the tape had been. Except now there were 2 tapes sitting there. The second one didn't have a label. He took it upstairs. Lacey was asleep, so he watched it alone. This one started with the same static, then cut to a shot of their own house. Not one like it, the actual house. The furniture matched, the color of the walls, the framed photos, even the throw blanket on the couch. Only one thing was off. The timestamp in the corner read, May 14th, 2005, 20 years before the house had been built. He watched frozen as the camera panned slowly from the living room toward the hallway. The hum started again. The lens drifted toward the basement door. The camera seemed to hesitate there, as if whoever was filming was afraid to open it. Then the picture warped, the colors bending and darkening until the frame went almost black. A faint outline appeared in the doorway, a figure standing just inside the shadows. For a second, he thought it looked like him. Same build, same haircut. The screen distorted again and the tape ended. The next morning, he told Lacey everything. She didn't believe the date stamp at first until he replayed it. Then she asked the only question that made sense. Who filmed this? They called the police that afternoon. 2 officers came, watched the tape, and looked through the house. They said it was probably a prank. Maybe someone staged the video digitally, but when Matt asked how anyone could have filmed inside their house before it existed, they didn't have an answer. They left with the tapes, promising to check them for tampering. A week later, the hum came back, louder this time, shaking the floor. The dog barked at the basement door until it lost its voice. Matt went down again, flashlight in hand, and saw that the wooden shelf was gone. In its place, there was a small rectangular patch of darker concrete, about the size of a door. The edges looked newer than the rest, as if something had been sealed there recently. He called the builder the next morning. The man sounded uneasy when Matt described it. "We poured that slab ourselves," he said. "There's nothing under it. It's just foundation." "Then why does it sound hollow?" Matt asked. The builder paused. It shouldn't. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the faint tremor in the walls. Around 3 a.m., the TV downstairs turned on by itself, flickering through static. Lacey woke up screaming. The kids were standing in the hallway, pointing toward the stairs. On the screen was their own living room again, same angle as before, only this time the image was live. Matt saw himself standing at the top of the stairs holding the remote. Then the picture cut to black. He unplugged the TV, pulled the cables from the wall, even cut the cord. Still, the faint hum continued beneath everything, like the low breath of something buried too deep to silence. The police never called back about the tapes. When he went to the station to ask, they said no evidence had been logged. They had no record of any officer taking them. A few weeks later, a real estate sign appeared 2 lots over, another new family moving in. Matt stood at the window watching the moving trucks arrive and thought about the man in the video saying, "Don't build here." He went down to the basement one last time, hoping to find nothing. Instead, he found another tape sitting in the center of the floor. No label, he didn't play it. He buried it in the field behind the house, deep enough that he thought the earth might keep it quiet. But that night, as he drifted toward sleep, the TV in the living room turned on again. The screen showed a man digging under the Texas moonlight. And from somewhere deep beneath the floor, the hum started again, steady, patient, and growing louder with every breath he took. I found the lantern at a yard sale off 8th Street, the kind of Saturday where Odessa feels like a scrapbook came to life. Card tables sagged with old tools and chipped dishware. A portable speaker hissed out a country song. The woman running it wore a UT Permian Basin shirt with paint spatters and a smile that looked carved and rehearsed. When I held the lantern up, dust flaked off in threads and fell into the crease of my thumb. It was a squat oil lantern with a rusted hood and glass cloudy as fingernails. There was no wick I could see, no cap for a fuel reservoir. It felt heavier than it looked, as if it kept some private center of gravity. "That was my granddad's," she said. Or at least that's what they told me. He worked rigs when rigs were skeleton towers and cigarettes were currency. $10 and it's yours. I gave her the 10, took a paper sack for it, and set it in the passenger seat of my Tacoma. I remember my hand drifting once or twice toward it on the drive home. The way your hand checks a pocket that holds a new key. Nothing in the world yet. Just a little extra weight and the idea of a story. I live near the edge of town where the streetlights give up and the blacktop unspools toward pump jacks nodding their slow approval beneath. A sky that seems too big to be real. Nights are noisy in a quiet way. Wind at the fence, a far dog that keeps having something to say, metal ticking as it cools. I set the lantern on my kitchen counter beside a bowl of screws and keys and receipts, and I forgot about it until dark. I keep late hours. I walk the house and adjust things that don't need adjusting. I check the deadbolt, then the stove knobs, then the deadbolt again. I ran a hand down the lantern's cold curve without thinking, the way you brush past a friend in a hallway, and my lights went out. It wasn't a power cut. The refrigerator motor hummed on. The clock on the microwave kept time. It was just the bulbs, as if they no longer felt like participating. In that sudden hush of brightness, something on the counter glowed with a low red throat. The lantern had lit itself. A coal of light pooled inside the cloudy glass, then it unfolded into a steady flame that made a sound like whispered paper. I should have been impressed or afraid, but the first thing I felt was irritated, the way you feel when a faucet keeps dripping and you can't decide which wrench fits. I reached to snuff it out and felt no heat. The glass was cool. The metal was cool. I pinched at air and came away with nothing but a sensation like pulling a string through a needle's eye. The flame stayed as it was. The kitchen became a little theater. Lantern light is different from electricity. It edits, it refuses to fill corners. It insists on beams and pockets and little caves. The shadows it drew around my coffee maker and the crooked neck of the faucet were thick as velvet. And then the strange thing happened. One of those shadows moved independent of the thing that made it. I watched my kettle cast a simple shape on the wall. Then a second shadow, taller than the kettle and shaped like a person's profile, stepped into the scene and paused as if listening. There was no person there. There was just my fridge, the bowl of screws, my silence. The shadow stood with its head dropped toward the sink, then lifted a hand. Its fingers were too long. I stepped back. The shadow of my body crossed the cabinets, and the second shadow intersected it without changing. It was separate, like a slide in an old projector layered over another. I turned on the kitchen light out of reflex. It came on, bright and clinical, and the lantern went black. The second shadow vanished. Something scurried across my nerves and hid where I couldn't find it. I stood with the switch pressed like that would matter. I let the light go again, and the lantern flamed steady. The second shadow came back and tilted its head toward me. It had no eyes, no details. It was a cutout. It lifted its long hand to where a mouth should be and pressed a finger there. I did not hear anything. I felt the suggestion of quiet, as if the room itself wanted me to hush. Then it turned its head toward the back door and thinned and stretched across the wall until it disappeared like smoke sinking into water. I slept badly. Dreams kept catching on fences and tearing. I woke twice with the sense that someone had passed down the hallway. The lantern sat cool and dead on the counter like a coin somebody forgot to spend. The next day I took it out under the carport and cleaned it with a rag and WD-40. Detail only goes so deep. Rust had a future it wanted to keep. When the sun went down over the black stripe of I-20, and the flares out near the refinery stitched their orange into the seam of the horizon, the lantern lit again without asking me. The kitchen lights chose that moment to forget their purpose. I stood and waited. This time the extra shadow didn't appear. Something else did. It was on the opposite wall above the trash can. A doorway that wasn't a doorway opened. A rectangle of deeper shadow appeared, hinged at one side. In the rectangle a stairway descended. The lantern light painted each step with a suggestion of grain. There is no basement in my house. The ground is hard caliche. I have a crawl space under the third bedroom, nothing more. Yet the lantern had found the idea of a stair that went somewhere not mine. I set the lantern on the floor, unreasonably careful, as if you might spill fire like coffee. The doorway stayed. Cold air lifted from the shadow and pressed against my shins with a damp hand. The smell held a note like rain that forgot how to be water. My name came through the opening in a voice that didn't belong to any person I knew. It sounded like my name after it had passed through many mouths and grew thin as it traveled. I told myself I was done. I turned on the overhead light and the doorway snapped shut the way a lizard disappears when your gaze lands on it. The lantern's flame rolled into itself and went out. I stood with the switch up and my breath climbing and falling against my teeth. I slept with the hallway light on like a child bunking in a motel. On the third night, I took the lantern outside to the back porch. Odessa wind hit my face and scrubbed something loose in my chest. The lantern lit. I watched it push a soft pool across the boards. Shadows gathered at the porch rail like men waiting their turn to climb into a truck bed. One leaned, one shifted a foot, one reached to scratch his cheek. They were not mine, and they were not accompanied by bodies. The yard beyond the pool of light was a black plate of nothing. Coyotes sang once far off. Then I saw the first face, not in detail but as an arrangement of shade that the mind decides is a face. It looked like a boy I had known in high school who drank too much on a ranch road and never came back. Next to him, another face that looked like my mother on the day she left. Her mouth set hard around a sentence she could not say. "That is when I did something I am not proud of," I said out loud with anger that felt brittle and false, that I didn't want any of this and the lantern could go to hell. I kicked at the shadows like a man who kicks a puddle. The shadows didn't move. The lantern flared higher, and when it flared, I saw something on the far side of the yard, past the chain link. A taller shape stood where the alley becomes an idea rather than a place. It filled the space between two salt cedars. It bent down and put a hand on the top of the fence as if checking the quality of my boundaries. The fingers left no dents, it leaned. I spoke again and said no. It was the no you use with a stray dog you know will bite if you love it. For 2 weeks I managed to ignore it as you ignore a tooth that talks to you. Work helped. I deliver parts to well sites and machine shops, turnarounds and yards where the men wear their names above their hearts. Odessa is a kind of museum with living exhibits. You see men who look 30 and are 50 and men who look 50 and are 30. Lunch is tacos and coffee strong enough to make your hand jitter. The wind has a hint of iron and salt, and on some days the flares paint their lies against the clouds. I kept the lantern in a cabinet. It didn't mind. Every night around 10, the kitchen lights dimmed to a mutter and the lantern lit and made the room into a scene again. If I left it behind a door, the light would outline the door as if the heart of a child beat inside. If I took it to the garage, it lit and showed me shadows of tools that were not mine. I saw a hand plane whose handle my dad would have fit to his palm. I saw the shadow of a bicycle with streamers in the grips. I saw a child about 8 crouched beside that bicycle and turning a wheel by hand slowly for the sake of its clicking song. The child's head turned toward me. There was no face yet. I felt a pair of eyes measuring me, not cruel, not kind, simply assessing as a nurse assesses a patient whose numbers do not add up. On a Friday, I drove out past the meteor crater early. The sign is brown and the parking lot is always empty when it is not a school field trip day. The crater is a shallow bowl, barely convincing anyone it landed from space. The wind there has no fear of any person. I was tired of being watched in my own house. I set the lantern on the rim and waited for dusk. Instruments of the sky began to play a tune that never changes. The lantern lit as if embers had been waiting underground all day for the cue. The crater filled with shadows. They moved like men moving around a job with a script only they could read. I saw the suggestion of a derrick that had never stood there and a truck that looked like the ghost of a 1950s Ford. I saw a man in a brimmed hat lean on his knee and look at the ground as if listening to it. He reached toward me. He stopped, his head turning to a place behind me, and I turned because you always turn. Someone stood on the path watching me. A woman in a windbreaker with her hands in the pockets and hair that the wind had given up on. She said she had seen my lantern from the road and had to know what kind it was. Her eyes shone the way eyes shine when they want to talk about anything except what they came to talk about. I lied and told her it was my granddad's. She nodded and said my granddad had one too, and the air between us did a little trick where it pretended to become shared. Then she tilted her head and asked if I ever saw things in its light. I said sometimes in a careful voice. She said she had one once that burned without fuel, and she had put it in a storage unit on 42nd Street. And when she came back, the unit had been cut open and everything except the lantern had been taken. The lantern sat in the center of the empty unit, glowing like a coal while the rest of her life was carried away. I did not ask her name. That feels unkind to me now. People appear with a key to your locked door and you let them open it, and then, because you are polite, you let them walk away with the key. She asked if she could hold mine. I handed it to her, expecting heat and getting none. The lantern liked her, or at least it tolerated her the way a cat tolerates the hand of a new guest. The shadows in the crater leaned toward us like tall grass leans toward a flatbed passing. The woman said her lantern started after her brother died in a tank battery accident out near No Trees. Fumes, a spark, a quick event they had spent days dressing as an accident. She said the lantern showed her his shape when she set it on the kitchen floor. He moved across the cabinets and touched the place where the junk drawer sticks. He said her name in that drawer's language. She said she sold her house a month later and left the lantern in the garage on a hook like a good coat. She said it showed up on the porch at her new apartment anyway. She asked if mine followed me. I said I had not tested that. She told me I would. Then she pressed it back to my hands and she walked toward her car without a sign that her question had been answered. The crater shadows folded as the sky emptied itself of orange. I brought the lantern home and set it in the sink. I opened a beer I didn't want and took 2 sips and poured the rest down the drain. The lantern kept its coal alive and patient. When midnight bruised the edges of the house, the first new thing came. It was my father's shape. Not him, but the apology of him cut into smoke. He had been a big man even when he was young. In the lantern's selection of darkness, his shoulders filled the hall. He didn't look at me. He did what he always did when he was present in the ordinary way. He checked the front door. He looked at the stove. He checked the thermostat as if it owed him money. Then he went into the spare bedroom and came back out and paused beneath the attic hatch. He reached up and put his palm there. He had done that when I was 10, and we had heard scratching that would not commit to the idea of being a raccoon. Then he turned toward me. I saw the place where his face would be if the light had been the kind of light that blesses with detail. He lifted his hand and the long fingers that did not belong to him, and pressed them where a mouth would think lips should go. That hush again. That request that wasn't a request. Then my father's shadow moved past and the house felt different, as if a coiled spring had chosen to become a line. I took the attic hatch down the next morning with a painter's pole and a pair of safety glasses, like a grown man who knows better. Dust lifted in a storm several seasons old. I stuck my head up through the square, and a wave of hot air punched the moisture out of my mouth. The attic is not a place you want to be in Odessa past 9 in the morning, but I went with a flashlight anyway. The beam found a picture frame without a picture, a dry wasp nest the size of a fist, 2 boards laid across joists as if someone had thought about storage then fallen out of love with the idea. In the corner near the hatch I found a shoebox wrapped in a grocery bag. Inside were letters folded and tucked in their envelopes again after being read. They were from my mother to my father during a separation they never spoke about, the year I turned 6. The handwriting looked like someone trying to keep her pen from running. Neat loops set down with concentration. I read 2, then pushed the box back. Maybe this is what the lantern wanted. Maybe it wants to solve puzzles that remain puzzles only because nobody wants the solution. If that was the work, it did not finish it. The lantern continued. With it, the other shadows continued. I saw a parade of shapes that matched no furniture and no body I could set in their place. A man in a hat with a tall crown stood at the window and sorted bills in the air with his fingers. A girl sat on the counter and swung her legs and then stopped mid-swing as if remembering something she wasn't supposed to forget. A woman with hair to her waist bent under the cabinets and stayed there, shoulders shaking the way shoulders shake when you cry into a towel. My name came again in that voice made from the tongues of rooms. It came from the hallway, then from the middle of the living room, then from the ceiling as if the air itself wanted to learn how to pronounce me. One night it changed. It was late. My clock flopped to 1 digit that pressed like a thumb on a bruise. The lantern lit, the lights died, and the yard slipped near. The porch screen wore the cool breath of early fall. The lantern's light found the alcove where the water heater lives and stopped there. The shadow that appeared made no sense. It was mine. Not the normal way. Not the way anything makes a version of you on a wall. It was me as if cut from some future photograph. The figure was turned 3/4, shoulders slumped, one hand clasping the lantern by its bail. The head was bent too near the glass. The skin at the cheek was too close to a surface that should have been hot but never was. The free hand reached up toward the mouth and pressed a finger there. I wanted to look away and could not make my eyes behave. The shape that was me moved across the hall toward the bedroom and placed the lantern on the floor just inside, as if reserving a seat for someone late to a show. Then the shape knelt. The kneeling happened fast as if the floor had a secret magnet. The shape rolled onto one side. The lantern's light grew, swallowing its glass. The flame inside ballooned and pressed like a drop of oil begging to separate from water. The shadows in the room gathered around that lantern, all the separate people made from cutouts of night, and their heads bent toward it with something like hunger or prayer. Then the scene went away as a slide goes away when the projector is turned off. I was left in my bright kitchen, the overhead humming to itself, the lantern on the counter cold as the idea of a coin. I did not tell anyone. You don't bring that into daylight unless you want to watch the daylight cut it up and label each piece with a name that means less than the thing. I went to work and delivered a stack of flanges to a yard off South Grandview. The manager signed the invoice with a name I could not spell. On the way home, I stopped at the Whataburger and ate in the truck watching a boy sit on a curb with his skateboard and make a phone call that lasted 6 seconds. He nodded twice without speaking and hung up and looked at his hands like they were tools he hadn't learned the names for yet. I wanted to tell him something useful. I drove home instead. The lantern was where I had left it and the sun had nowhere else to be. That evening, because I am not wise, I did something you might expect. I drove west past the stadium lights and the strip malls that grow along the highway like vines on a fence, and parked at the gate of an old lease road. I took bolt cutters out of the bed and snipped the chain. I told myself I would return with a new one. I told myself many small lies that night. I drove a mile down a caliche track that felt like a rib cage and stopped where a pump jack bowed its slow prayers. I set the lantern on the running board and the lantern lit and the pump jack's head threw its solemn arc of shadow onto the dirt. It made a metronome on the edge of my boot. For a long time, nothing happened that did not belong to pumping and wind. Then the other shadows declared themselves. Men gathered beneath the horsehead and rested their hands on tools built of darkness. One reached into the wellhead and withdrew his arm with a flourish that meant a joke had been made. Another took off his hat, shook his head and put his hat back on again. They moved without sound. They had no weight, yet when the wind shifted, it brought me a smell that did not sleep. A cross between gasoline, damp wool, and the metal of pennies. It carried a note of something older than my county. I stood with my hands in my jacket and thought they were warm only because I had decided they were. The men turned toward me as one would turn toward a truck's headlights. Their faces were exactly everything and nothing. They put their fingers to the place where mouths might belong, that long gesture I had come to know. And the night pushed down a little harder on my shoulders. I felt my phone buzz. I don't remember taking it out. A message glowed from an unknown number. The text was 4 words. Set it down inside. I looked up. The pump jack bent and rose. The men of shadow waited. I wrote back 3 words. Inside of where? The reply came immediately. Your house. The lantern's flame quivered but did not change in size. The phone buzzed again. It will not stop until you do. After that, there was nothing else to read. The screen's light made a stupid blue on my hand. I put the phone into my pocket and forgot where I put it and then found it again and put it in the other pocket, because that felt like control. I took the lantern home. I set it inside the threshold of the bedroom exactly where the version of me had set it in my kitchen vision. I was fully prepared to mock myself. It lit as always. The shadows gathered like hungry attendees at a church supper. I felt the ceiling lower. I knelt, my body did not rush. It was simply the easiest thing to do. Gravity found me. Knees first, then hip, then shoulder. The floor felt like a dock with water knocking against it. The lantern flame blossomed and made a high, thin sound, like a tea kettle 3 houses down. The shadows leaned. I put my hand out toward the glass because I am a person whose hands insist on touching what hurts. The glass was not ice and it was not fire. It was an absence of temperature. It invited. What happened then refused to sort itself into cause and effect. The floor and the lantern and me in the shadows folded the way maps fold after a long trip. I smelled cedar like an old pencil ground to a point. The room made a sound like wind through the rib cages of houses under construction. The flame stretched into a shape that did not belong to flame or to any visible thing. It was a line, then a sheet, then a mouth big enough to accept an idea. My name came once more from nowhere with no oxygen. It didn't ask for me. It announced me. It said I was somewhere that needed that information. I woke on the bed sometime later with the lantern standing dark by the door and a ring on the floorboards where its light had rested. The ring was not burn. It was a kind of stiffness in the wood. If you pressed your palm there, your skin took a long time to forget. I thought of calling someone. I thought of going to a church and sitting in the back and letting the music do work that belonged to talking. Instead, I went to the kitchen and made coffee with hands that missed the aim of the scoop. The lantern stayed unlit and behaved like an ordinary thing, which only made it worse. In the days that followed, I noticed changes that would be nothing if they were alone. My reflection in the hallway mirror had learned a new habit of lagging. When I got in the truck and backed out, I saw in the house window the faint suggestion of a person standing where I had been standing, as if the world had decided to leave a chalk mark to help me remember my exact position. When I walked past the bedroom door at night, the ring on the floor seemed to be darker than the rest of the wood, even with the lights off. More than once, I put my foot into the ring and felt a pressure up the bones of my leg as if someone had balanced a heavy book on my knee. I did not light the lantern anymore. That did not matter. It lit itself. It waited until the house settled and the appliances whispered their last phrases, and the wind checked each window and moved on. Then it would glow and the extra shadows would come, not every night but enough nights to make a rhythm. They never spoke in a way the ear could use. They touched their mouths and asked the room to be quiet. They showed me scenes the way dreams show you scenes, with no explanation. A road shoulder with a pair of children's shoes. One shoe tipped as if the foot had come out of it mid-step. A porch with a mirror turning night into a hallway. A patch of dirt by a church where a key fit a lock it was not designed to fit. Only later did I hear about those things as rumors traveling through coffee shops and break rooms. Only later did I realize the lantern broadcast a signal nobody wanted to receive. You read enough of this and you think you see where it ends. You think the lantern is a haunted thing and I am a man leased to it, and the town is one long note that flattens the heart. Maybe that is true. Maybe this is the kind of story that fits into a pocket, and you take it out and smooth it and show it to a friend and then forget you have it. But there is one more part I have not set down. I did not tell anyone at the time because it involved the one resource that still felt like a secret to me, and sharing it felt like casting a vote against myself. The morning it rained. Really rained. Not just a brush of spit across the windshield. The lantern had been quiet for 3 nights. I stood at the sink watching drops chase each other down the glass. Odessa becomes a different place in rain. The dust sits down for a minute. The air smells like somebody finally hosed off the porch. I thought about taking a long drive to the Monahan sand hills and walking up a dune until the world worked itself out. Then the kitchen lights made their decision and bowed out. The lantern flared from dark to full without the polite step of coal to flame. The ring on the bedroom floor cooled the house by a full degree. The scene in the living room filled like water rising. For one spare second I saw nothing, and then I saw the thing that has not left me. It was my house, but not present tense. The walls had changed, swollen with damp that hadn't happened. The ceiling in the corner bore a stain and an outline that looked like a hand blown up and pressed to the paint. My couch was not the couch I own. It was a couch I owned in 2009. The one a friend left in my apartment when he chased a job near Dallas, and I kept meaning to return it. There were photos on the wall in frames I don't use. In one, my face at a barbecue, younger and sunburned and attempting a smile. In another, a woman I had loved well but in the wrong calendar, caught mid-laugh with her mouth open like a small bird. The lantern sat in the middle of the floor and the flame grew until it became a hole. Through that hole the view turned. I saw a bedroom with different paint, a kitchen with a table I had not yet bought, a hallway with scuffs I recognized from a house I toured and did not rent. The lantern showed me my house if I had gone left at all the rights and right at all the lefts. My life as a map of streets at night with headlights making unchosen turns. The shadows in those rooms moved the way I move when I am alone, precise and careless. Then from out of those rooms stepped my shape again, future or other or twin. And he lifted his finger the way they all lift it. The hush came, but this one was different. It had a weight to it, a promise. It said there would come a night when the lantern would light, and the ring would ask for me, and I would get down on my knees and lay my cheek near glass and listen to nothing and know that nothing was not empty. This is the part you want me to explain. I cannot. I can only tell you the end the lantern gave me. Because it has given me an end even while I continue to walk around and make coffee and buy gas like a man unended. That night with the rain, when the scene folded and the lights woke and pretended they had been there the whole time, I picked up the lantern and felt something inside it shift, as if a bead of mercury had rolled from one side of a mystery to the other. I told the lantern I was not going to kneel for it again. I told it that if it wanted me, it had already had me. I put it on the porch where the wind could tell it about the long, flat places. I left it there. The porch boards shivered under its small weight. Coyotes sang over by the school. I slept. In the morning, the lantern was not on the porch. It was in the truck on the passenger seat where I had put it the day I bought it, as if the night had driven my memories into the present and told me to start over. A ring of moisture spread beneath it on the vinyl like a spilling that never quite occurred. I picked it up and looked for writing or a plate that might tell me who made it and when. Some fixed point. There was nothing but rust, the bloom of time that eats careful edges. I set it on the seat and drove without intending to drive anywhere. I passed the football stadium and the mall and all the storefront churches with their doors hung open like mouths inviting a better story in. I got on 42nd and took it to a public storage yard because some part of me still wants locks to matter. I paid for a unit with a card and a signature that looked like someone else's handwriting. I put the lantern on the concrete inside and shut the door and slid the bolt and spun the lock and pulled on it twice for luck. I stood there while the sun rode higher and turned the metal doors into mirrors that showed me exact versions of my frown. When I reached home, the house smelled like rain and dust arguing about who owned the air. The ring on the bedroom floor looked darker than it had the night before, as if the wood were bruising. I made a sandwich and ate half and set the other half down in the sink because the sink felt like a safe place. And I walked the rooms without meaning to check for anything, and that is when I saw it. The lantern was back on the kitchen counter beside the bowl of screws and keys and receipts, exactly where it had been the night it first lit. A drop of water hung from the lip of its hood like a question mark with nothing to punctuate. The overhead light paused and then decided to keep working as if embarrassed. I sat down on the floor and put my back to the cabinets and stared at the thing until my eyes registered that humans are not made to hold one object in their focus for long. If you come by the house now on a weeknight and look through the window, you will not see me. I turn the lamps on earlier than I used to, and I keep the blinds partly closed. The lantern has chosen a schedule that feels like a habit we share. It lights near 10, holds its glow steady, shows me what it wants to show me, then it rests. I have stopped trying to interpret. I have decided the shadows are neither warnings nor hauntings in the traditional sense. They are the way the town talks when nobody is around to correct its grammar. Odessa absorbs its people and releases them in weather. It keeps a ledger that only odd light can read. The lantern is a tool fashioned for that reading, and it found a simple, lonely man to carry it around from room to room and edifice to field while it performs its small service. Maybe it belongs to the woman at the crater, maybe to her brother, maybe to the man in the hat who kept his name behind his teeth. Maybe it belongs to the empty we all keep in us to hold the shape of the next house. Sometimes I drive. I take the lantern and put it on the passenger seat and head west on I-20 until the lights of Odessa buckle and the black land opens its mouth. Then I turn onto an FM road and roll the windows down and let the air slap me awake, and I tell myself it is just air. At some point, the lantern lights on its own. The glass grows a small sun. The upholstery does not warm. The shadows it casts aren't mine or the truck's. They run along the bar ditches beside me, swift as deer. They keep pace without lifting their feet. If you ever drive that way late and catch a second shadow, where there should be only one under the streetlight by the last gas station, if you see something like a man moving alongside your door without the man attached, don't be afraid, or be afraid in the way that wakes you but doesn't break you. Lift your hand a little off the wheel and press your finger briefly to your lips. It isn't a command. It is an acknowledgement that there are rooms in this place where light does different work. And if you are lucky, the work will not require anything from you except that small kindness. If we meet, you and I, it will be in the edge of a store where everything useful sits on a pegboard. You'll be fingering a box of screws and trying to decide between two sizes that both seem wrong. I'll be the man with a ring burned into nothing on the floor of his bedroom and a lantern in his truck that isn't in his truck. And I'll ask you if you've ever seen light that doesn't ask permission. If you say no, I'll smile and let it be. If you say yes, I'll ask if your shadows ever raised their hands to their mouths. And if they did, we will stand there without speaking for a moment that feels like a mile of empty road. And then we'll both look down and pretend to read the back of a package. And we'll go home and wait for night like patient animals. One day, soon or not, the ring will ask again. I feel this the way you feel a storm while the sun is still shining. When it does, I will kneel. I will put my cheek near glass. I will listen to nothing and hear the sound of a stair where there are no stairs and a door where there is no door. I will see the town reduced to a set of lines and the faces I love drawn in charcoal, smudged by a careful thumb. I will learn what the lantern has been trying to teach me, that all we do is cast versions of ourselves on walls and wait for a light we did not build to pass over us and make us make sense for a moment, and then we are unmade and turned back into the plain, polite dark that lies down across the pump jacks and the refinery, and the stadium and the stalled cars and the sand hills and the crater, and the houses that have learned to keep quiet. When that happens, you might see me again in the corner of some room, just a shape with a long hand, and you'll wonder if I am mine or yours or the lantern's. Touch your finger to your mouth and I will understand. I will stand down. I will move along. The lantern will burn without fuel, and the shadows will line up where light puts them, and Odessa will go on with what Odessa does, which is to hold a great deal of sky and a great many stories and give neither of them away. I did not notice the handprint the day I bought the house. That is the kind of thing you tell yourself later to keep from feeling like you missed an omen. The porch was a wide rectangle of gray concrete under a shallow roofline, its paint chalked by the Sherman sun, the steps shallow enough that my knee didn't complain when I carried boxes up from the truck. The realtor kept talking about the schools and the growing scene downtown along Travis Street, and I kept nodding and glancing at the pecan tree that leaned over the yard like it had something to say. I did not look down until the first night, when the cicadas were at it and a thin wind came in from the direction of Lake Texoma, bringing the smell of damp limestone and boat oil, and I stood in the doorway sweating and letting the house breathe around me. That is when I saw it, left of the threshold, near the post with the little aluminum house number screwed into it, a handprint set deep into the slab. Not a child's curiosity or a frat prank, but a thing impressed with such force it had ridges and whorls like a photograph. The fingers were a touch too long. The palm was cupped like it had been pushing up. In the shallow dark, it looked wet. I told myself some concrete finisher had a sense of humor in 1954 or 1968, or some other year the porch had been poured. And because I was tired and divorced and trying not to think about the little apartment in Dallas where my boxes had been stacked floor to ceiling, I went to bed and let the cicadas talk their nonsense into the night until sleep took me. Around 2, I woke to what I thought was my neighbor's screen door slapping. The neighborhood is old, the streets wide and a little sunburned, the curbs crumbling. A freight train rolls through Sherman at all hours, the BNSF line humming like a long mechanical sigh, and you get used to it. But I lay there and heard it again, an even thump. And it was not the screen door and it was not the train. It came from under me, a soft, patient thud like someone testing the underside of a table with a knuckle. It went on for a minute, each thump spaced just long enough to make me listen for it. Then it stopped. The next morning I told myself the old floor joists were settling. I brewed coffee and walked the yard in my socks and noticed where the Red River wind had pushed fine grit into the seams of the porch. There was a faint footprint in that grit, a smear like a bare heel had twisted. I told myself I had done that last night with my own heel, even though I remembered wearing boots, and I took a broom to it and to the leaves that had collected against the bottom step, and tried not to look at the handprint because the morning sun had put it into high relief. The lines looked like they would cut your finger if you traced them. The neighbor on the right was a man in his 60s with a Ford Ranger and a tendency to watch the block from a lawn chair on his porch. He introduced himself as Ben and asked if I was settling in. We talked about the way traffic backed up on US 75 if there was a wreck, and about the new coffee place on Lamar that everyone said was too expensive. I asked him how long the house had sat empty, and he said a year, maybe a year and a half. He looked toward my porch while he said it, not at the windows or the shingles, but at the slab. I asked him if he knew anything about it, and I gestured, and he had already nodded before I finished. He said the previous owner had tried to grind it out once. He had a guy come with a machine, and they chewed the concrete down a 1/4 inch and then troweled a skim coat. The handprint came back that night. He said that with the same tone a mechanic uses to tell you the knock in your engine is not a belt, but a cracked rod. I laughed because that is what I do when I am not sure of the road ahead. Ben did not laugh. He told me if I heard anything under the porch at night, I should not go out. He told me to wait until daylight. He said it simple and without drama, as if he were telling me not to leave my trash can out past pickup. I asked what it was, and he shook his head and said he had lived here 30 years and some things you just step around. He said it like advice and warning at once. That evening I drove out toward the water to breathe, past the long, low horizon of Denison Dam, and the way the lake throws its own light, even after sunset. North Texas dusk has a particular violet to it if the day has been hot and the air is tired, and that violet worked itself into the pecan leaves back home as I pulled into my driveway. I stood with my keys in my hand and stared at the handprint without meaning to. A moth touched the porch light and made a sound like a fingernail on a cheap lampshade. It was fully dark when I heard it again. Thump, thump. Not frantic, not angry, patient, testing. I lay still and told myself the boards were adjusting to the night air, that a possum was heavy-footing the perimeter, that my mind was looking for a pattern because it was my first week in a new house and my life had the shape of a circle for the first time in years. Then I heard it shift, not a thump but the sound of something dragging its skin against what held it. It wasn't metal. It wasn't wood. It had that dense, gritty, muffled tone you hear when a heavy book slides across a slab. My phone showed 2:17. The sound lasted 5 counts, stopped, then 5 again. Then a long pause in which I could hear my own breath getting in the way of my thinking. When you live alone, you know the map of your own house at night. You can walk it with your eyes closed. You can point to where the kitchen tile begins and the old pine ends. You know where the cold drafts are and where the fridge hums. The thump came from right where the front door met the porch. It came in pairs now, with a little space between, like someone was using both hands, except no, not hands, one hand and the heel of something. I did not go out, but I did go to the front room and stand without turning on any lights. And through the window I could see the porch light making its yellow cone, and I could see the handprint like an oil stain within that cone. The glass gave me my own reflection and something else too, a weak little shifting. I thought my eyes were playing with me because of the screen and whatever film had built up on the window. But after a full minute, I saw the concrete inside the print darken like a sponge taking water. It glistened. The night held its breath. The handprint looked wet again. Morning made a liar of me, as mornings will. The concrete was dry and chalky. There was a thin dusting of grit kicked up around the print, and I told myself I was finally seeing my own boot scuffs. That this was how folklore worked. A little sound and a little dark, and the mind did the rest. I went to work and came back and made a point of stepping on that hand with my own foot. It is amazing what a gesture will do for a man's pride. I pressed down and ground my heel and felt stupid about feeling brave. The recessed whorls of the print held onto dirt like tiny irrigated grooves. When I lifted my foot, I had a perfect ring of gray on my boot tread. The next thump that night was louder. Not the immediacy of a blow. It was the sound of something meeting something that had always resisted it. And this time, when I lay there pretending not to be counting, I felt the floor under my bed answer with a tremor. I got up, I turned on no lights. I unlocked the front door and opened it. The porch light haloed the post and the pecan tree shadow cut a diagonal across the slab. The handprint was not alone. 5 faint arcs of moisture curved outward from each finger like someone had been kneading at the edges. Like whatever lay under there had spread its hand wide and tried again. I shut the door and leaned my forehead against the cool of it and stood there thinking about denial. In the morning, I went to the Grayson County Records office because sometimes a person needs a paper fact to push back against a thing that makes no sense. The courthouse smells like floor wax and old books and a little like, you have wandered into a place your grandfather would be more comfortable than you. A woman with a badge showed me how to look up the parcel history, and I learned dates the way you learn the bones of a thing you thought you knew. The lot had been open ground until 1949. Before that, there had been a smaller structure, torn down after a fire that was described in the shortest possible way in the newspaper archive. In 1931, there had been a well on the property. In 1907, there had been nothing but pecans and a wagon path that ran down to a creek bed. The name that was attached most often to these pieces of the property was Brannan. In 1931, there was a note in the paper about a young man named Harlan Brannan, who had gone missing from his job at a lumber yard after what they called a domestic trouble, and there was a rumor he had left for Oklahoma. Another paper contradicted that 2 days later and said he had been seen near the Red River. Another said nothing at all, as if saying less would shorten the distance between then and now. When I asked if anyone would know about the porch being poured, the woman with the badge told me to look at a permit from 1954. They had used a different address scheme then, and the paper was so thin I was afraid of my own fingers. But there was the number, and there in blue pencil was written porch. No names, no labor. Just the scrawl of an inspector who did not know he was writing a word that would outlast his own. I drove back slow on Taylor Street and thought of the word porch as if it were a prayer. A thing you say over and over to keep the other thing at bay. Ben was on his steps drowning a mosquito with his hand when I pulled in. I told him what I had read. He listened with his chin thrust out like he was catching rain. He said he did not know any Brannans. He knew a Brennan who worked at the feed store in Howe, but that was not the same.
He asked me if I had slept.
I told him about the arcs of wet. He told me if I was going to do anything, do it in the day and do it with something that cut deep. He said it like he was telling me which side of the street to park on for trash day. Fear has a way of making you industrious. I went to the rental place and signed out a grinder and a diamond wheel and brought it home in the bed of my truck and set it down on the porch like a dare. I put on a mask and goggles and knee pads and ran a line of tape to mark the edges of that hand. I pressed the wheel down and it screamed against the slab, and a glitter of cement dust rose into the Texas afternoon and blew toward the pecan tree. I ground until the ridges of the print were gone. My shoulders hurt and my forearms shook, and the grinder bucked and danced, and I manhandled it into an obedience that felt like victory. I chopped back the dust and got a bag of patch and mixed it with water in a plastic tub and troweled it on in layers, working it smooth until you could not tell a hand had ever been there. The patch dried the color of a healed scar. I hosed the porch down and watched the water run clear. The sun sank and the violet drew itself across the pecan leaves, and I made myself stand on that patch like a man, christening the deck of a boat he built with his own hands. I slept hard out of spite and woke to a sound I can still feel in my jaw. Not a thump, a knock. Hard, hollow, confident. Then another, lower, broader, like the heel of a hand. The floor under me gave a little, as if the house had taken a breath. I walked to the door in a way I would not call brave, and when I opened it, there was a wet palm print on the new patch, perfect as a signature. The fingers were longer than they should have been. The whorls were deeper than any hand could leave in material already cured. The wrist disappeared into the concrete, as if the rest of the arm were there on the other side. The porch light hummed. A moth killed itself against the bulb. The print glistened like a thing thinking about me. I did not go to Ben this time. I went under the house. The crawl space runs low and tight. You have to lie on your side and pull yourself along. I took a flashlight and a flat pry bar, and 6 feet in I could already taste the old dust on my tongue like a punishment. The joists are dry pine and the lattice vents drop little squares of sun onto the dirt. The beam that runs just inside the front wall is older than the rest. It is black where something once dripped and dried. The foundation sits on short piers, and between the piers there is dirt and a kind of compacted gravel that has been there since before the porch. I pressed my ear to the underside of the sill plate. There was nothing for a count of 10, then a single slow thump that I felt more than heard, like standing too close to a bass drum. The pry bar slid under the edge of a board that had been sistered in some repair decades ago. Nails complain even after all these years. The board came up, and behind it was a dark that did not feel like absence but presence. The smell was not rot. It was the cold iron smell you get from wet stone. The flashlight showed me a void under the porch slab, a pocket that had been left when the form was pulled and the earth settled. It was not large, but it was larger than it should have been. The dirt had subsided and left a shallow dome. The underside of the concrete was smooth and pale, and in that pale I could see something like the shadow of a hand moving, not on the surface but within it. When I told this later, I said it was like watching a fish behind frosted glass, the broad palm sliding and then pressing, the fingers stretching into shape. The thump when it came again shook grit down into my face. I did not think. I jammed the pry bar into the dirt and dug like a dog, and when the bar rang against something hard, I scraped until I saw the tip of a glass jar. It was colorless and old and full, not of water or nails, but of fine dark ash. There were other shapes too. Little bundles wrapped tight in cloth, the kind of cloth that survives too long because it was meant to, tarry and foul to the touch. The porch made a sound then, a long, tired sigh, and a hairline crack shot out from the place where the handprint lived. A lightning fork that ran in 2 directions at once. It stopped by itself like it had met an old boundary. The light in my hand made the void look like a mouth. I backed out hard enough to bang my shoulder, and in that moment I felt the floor above my spine flex. The door rattled in its frame. The house went still. At noon, I drove to the library because the courthouse had given me dates and I wanted stories to go with them. The Sherman Democrat is preserved on microfilm like a secret you need a machine to tell you. I scrolled through months around 1931 and read about a fire in a boarding house on Lamar with no casualties. I read about a boy's body pulled from Choctaw Creek and the way they used to write about grief like it was weather. I found a small notice about a young man named Harlan who had owed money and left town, and a gossip column that contradicted itself by reporting he had been seen in Durant. I did not find anything about a well. When I asked the librarian if there had been a well on Taylor Street, she said most houses had them once and many were capped. And sometimes when a property changed hands, the cap got punched and recapped, and sometimes it did not. Sometimes it waited. When I came home, I sat on the top step and looked at the handprint, and the little rivers of hairline crack and the way the patch I had applied caught the afternoon light like new skin. The pecan leaves whispered even though the air was still. I put my own hand down next to the print. My palm is not large, I have a little scar at the base of my thumb from where a chisel slipped when I was 20, and trying to make bookshelves out of a door. The other hand, the one in the concrete, was longer, but the heel of it matched mine exactly. I could feel the temperature difference through my skin. My palm rested on heat. The print was cool. I told myself to go inside. I told myself to wait for daylight, as Ben had said. I didn't either. The sledgehammer was in the garage from when I had broken the half-rotten workbench. The head of it is scarred, the handle smooth from too many hands. I stood over the handprint and brought the hammer down. The sound turned birds out of the pecan tree. A little spall of concrete jumped away. I swung again, and the slab answered in a way that was not sound so much as a sense of something waking and remembering its own edges. I kept swinging until a palm-sized piece popped free and skittered across the porch. Under it, where there should have been compacted earth and the undersides of forms, there was a hollow. Not darkness, not void, a shallow bowl of space like a mouth between a person's upper lip and teeth. In that bowl, something pale lay like a heel pressed against a sheet from underneath. When it rolled toward the hole, I dropped the hammer. I did not mean to, but I did. The thing that slid up to the edge was a palm, but not in the way a biology book would choose. It was pale and tense and a little too smooth, as if it had healed from burns none of us could imagine. The fingers were long in a way that made my kneecaps feel wrong. They flexed once, twice, and the first knuckle knocked the underside of the slab like a person who knows you are home and will not be kept on the porch. I do not know how long I stood there with my mouth open and no sound in it. I know that when I stumbled back, the palm flattened itself and pushed, and the concrete edge splintered, and a piece the size of a plate raised and then fell as if that had exhausted something. In the quiet after, the cicadas wound back up like someone had turned the crank. I left the porch to itself that night. I slept on the couch in the back room with a fan on so I would not hear the thumps. The fan did not help because the house knows what you're trying to do. The rhythm woke me anyway. Now steady, now closer together, now the quick searching raps of someone finding a stud behind plaster. Morning found dust everywhere, fine and gray and in patterns that looked like finger drags. Ben did not come out onto his porch when I did. The ranger was gone. The street looked emptied by some agreement I had not been part of. The patch I had made was broken in a perfect rectangle around the handprint, which was deeper now, the heel of the palm denting downward like a seat cushion that remembers the weight. Somewhere a dog barked at nothing it could name. I went under the house again because there are some mistakes you only make once and then you make them again, to prove the first one was not a mistake but a choice. The jar of ash lay where I had left it. I picked it up. The lid was wired on with a twist that had fused to itself. I thought of Harlan and of the well and of the stories people do not write down because they do not need to. I thought of the way the porch had been poured and what a convenient thing it is to cap a problem with a thing you can sweep. I set the jar on the dirt and rolled it with my palm and felt the ash inside slide. Something in my head said don't and something in my hand said now. The wire gave. The lid hissed like breath. The smell that came up was cold stone and iron. The ash inside was dark and oddly heavy, and underneath it there were little things wrapped in paper, the paper waxy and translucent with age. I unrolled one and found a lock of hair tied with thread. Another held a fingernail, not long, not frightening in itself, but the sense of it made my throat close. There are ways people bargain with what they cannot see. There are ways they feed and make agreements and then forget the words. The porch above me sounded once, a deep, hollow knock, and in the shine of my flashlight a hairline crumble of concrete dust fell in a little veil. I scooped the ash back into the jar and pressed the lid on and rolled it into the hole again, like a man offering a purse to a thief in a city he does not know. The porch answered with one hard thump that shook the light out of my hand. In that moment, I knew two things with the clarity you do not like to admit later. The thing wanted the weight back, and it knew my hand now. After that, I did the foolish, ordinary things. I called a contractor who told me he could cut the porch out and re-pour for more than I wanted to hear. I asked if he had ever seen anything like my handprint, and he said you wouldn't believe the things you find under these old houses. He said it like a man talking about cats. I slept with the bedroom door open and a Halligan bar by the bed like I was a firefighter who had lost his calendar. I started dreaming, not of the hand but of a staircase that went down from my porch into a trick of space that had no bottom. The wind off Texoma turned hot for a few days, and every night at 2 or a little after, the thump came like a pulse. When I tried to ignore it, it grew louder. When I stood over it, it grew patient. I put my hand down next to the print again, and the cool inside the concrete felt closer, like a breath behind glass. The night I finally made the mistake that completes a circle. I had been drinking, but not so much that I could blame the bottle. A storm had risen over the lake and worked its way into town in a bruised green line. Thunder is not a single sound here. It is a march of it, rolling and answering. The power went out just before midnight, and the neighborhood drew breath and held it. The porch light died, and my house looked like a postcard from 1931. I went to the front door and opened it, and stood in the warm breath of the storm. The handprint was a darker oval in a gray slab I could feel rather than see. The first lightning made the world show its bones, and in that instant, the whorls of the print shone like oil. I put my palm down without thinking, because some part of me wanted to show it I was not afraid. That I had the kind of courage men in stories always discover just before the last page. My hand fit heel to heel so perfectly I felt a little shock in my wrist. The concrete was not cold. It was the temperature of my own skin. I do not know what I expected. A jolt, an arm latching onto mine, the slab breaking like a pain. What I got was a slow, deep pressure up into my palm from the other side, as if another hand was matching mine and pushing back, not to grab, but to agree. The pressure grew until my knuckles creaked. My instinct was to pull away, but agreement is a hard thing to break once you have made it. Something in the slab flexed, a minute yielding, a slackening like a held breath released, and in that slack my hand sank the thickness of a coin, not down into space, but into the idea of space. Lightning flashed again, and in that dead white light my palm looked like it was wearing a glove made of stone. The pressure became pain. Not sharp, not theatrical, but a deep ache that felt like it wanted to enter my bones and live there. I yanked. For a second I could not tell if I was pulling away from it or it from me. Then I fell backward, my wrist free. The concrete around the print showed the faintest raised lip now, a swelling that had not been there before. And in the center, where my palm had pressed, new whorls lay like a new growth of something on a stump. I went inside and ran water on my hand. There was no mark I could show anyone. There was only the feeling that the line of my life in that palm had been redrawn by a pencil I could not hold. The power came back around 2:30. The air conditioner coughed into life. The porch thumped once like a heart, giving a single long beat, and then it stopped. I lay in bed with my hand against my chest and felt the ache of it recede to a memory. The next morning I found Ben on his porch with a thermos and the look of a man waiting for a dog that was never going to come home. I told him what I had done. He looked not surprised, not even disappointed. He looked like someone who has seen a river flood and knows the water does not ask for permission. He said some houses have their own ways. He said he had heard the thumps since the late 90s and had learned to let them be. He said the man before me had not. He said he had found that man sitting on his own steps once with his hand against the concrete, like he was feeling for a pulse. He said the man moved soon after and the house sat and waited. The rest should be a lesson about leaving well enough alone. You would expect me to say I put the place on the market and went back to Dallas or on to Denton, that I took long walks along US 82 and told myself the world is built on top of things and we do not owe them anything. I did not move. The house was cheap and the yard had the right light in late afternoon, and I am stubborn in the way that makes men ruin what they love. For a week the porch was quiet. The handprint did not glisten. The hairline crack looked like any old age. I convinced myself I had misread the world. Then one Thursday night, long after the last train rolled past and the cicadas were in that dreamy, steady second wind, the thump came back. It was not testing this time. It was not patient. It was insistent and regular, and it made a picture in my head of someone pushing a stuck window up and up and up until it goes. I got up and went to the door and did not turn on the light. The street was dark and felt far away. I set my hand beside the print again, and the ache in my wrist flared like an old injury waking to weather. My palm fit more perfectly now, as if my hand had learned or the print had. The pressure came slower this time, a negotiation. I let it push, and when my instinct said to pull away, I let it push a little more. The concrete softened, not like water or clay, but like the idea of hardness giving a little. My hand slid in the thickness of a coin again, and then another. The porch made a sound like ice breaking on a river. The slab gave, barely, but enough that I understood the thing beneath did not need to yank me under. It only needed me to say yes. I wish I could tell you I did not. I wish I could tell you the story of a man who learned. But the truth is quieter and worse. I pressed down in answer. The other palm met mine with a certainty that felt like relief. The ache ran up my forearm and into my shoulder and then into my chest. The violet the sky gets at 2 in the morning folded itself into the pecan leaves, and I watched the print in the concrete bloom with the whorls of my own skin. When I lifted my hand away, a second handprint lay within the first. A perfect heel to heel, a pair of overlapping lives. The slab was hard again. The night was the same. Somewhere a truck turned onto Taylor and idled and moved on. Inside, the house let a little cool air run along the floor like a cat. I went to bed with a new map in my head. I do not think it will take 30 years for the next person to notice what I have done. The handprint is deeper now. The edges are cleaner. When the wind comes down from Texoma, you can smell the dam and the old limestone. And when that wind hits the porch, it carries a cooler draft than it should. If you stand in the doorway in the violet hour and lay your hand beside the print, you will feel that temperature difference like breath behind a door. You will tell yourself a concrete finisher had a sense of humor in 1954. You will tell yourself it is nothing. Then later, around 2, you will hear a thump from under your bed. It will not be angry. It will not be a threat. It will be an invitation in the language a house speaks when it has your hand already inside its palm. I will hear it too, next door or across the years, because the circle is a comfort to the thing beneath, and to those of us who agree to it. If you listen closely, you will hear 2 sounds now, not one. The faint, familiar knock of something pushing up, and a softer answering thump above it, spaced just right, the reply of a hand on a slab teaching someone how to push back through.